My husband's 24-year-old secretary thought a simple picture would destroy my world. She thought sending an ultrasound with a fake apology would make me pack my bags and walk away quietly. She assumed I was just the clueless wife sitting at home. But when I looked closely at that black and white scan, I did not cry. I saw the clinic code. I knew exactly whose baby she was carrying, and I knew the multi-million-dollar secret they were trying to hide. I did not scream. I just logged into the company's main social media account, smiled, and hit post. Let me tell you exactly how I burned their perfect life to the ground. The morning it happened, our house was a chaotic symphony of hissing espresso machines and the low, steady hum of the cooling fans on my encrypted servers. My name is Jessica. I am 32 years old, and for the last 4 years, I have been the invisible ghost in the machine of my husband's tech empire. Julian is the charismatic chief executive officer of Nova Freight, a logistics tech firm that recently hit a massive valuation and is gearing up for a highly anticipated initial public offering. Everyone in our wealthy Chicago suburb thinks I am just the lucky housewife who spends her days redecorating our 5,000-square-foot home and attending charity luncheons. They have no idea that before I married Julian, I was a senior data architect for a top-tier cybersecurity firm. They do not know that I wrote the foundational back-end code for Nova Freight from our cramped apartment living room, sacrificing my own high-paying career so Julian could stand on stages and play the brilliant visionary. I gave up everything to build his throne. I was sitting at my kitchen island running a routine diagnostic check on the home network server logs. Julian had rushed out an hour earlier, aggressively adjusting his silk tie and claiming he had an emergency breakfast meeting with aggressive venture capitalists. I had my blue light-blocking glasses pushed up on my head, a cold mug of black coffee in one hand, completely immersed in scrolling lines of encrypted data. Then my phone lit up on the cold marble counter. A single text message notification vibrated heavily against the stone. It was from Madison. Madison is Julian's executive secretary. She is 24 years old, fresh out of a mid-tier college with a penchant for wearing inappropriately sheer blouses to the office and carrying luxury designer bags she supposedly buys on a modest entry-level salary. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. There was a high-resolution image file attached, followed immediately by a text that read, "Oops, so sorry Jessica, wrong chat." Wrong. I tapped the image to expand it, the harsh brightness of the screen illuminating my face. It was an ultrasound. A clear, undeniable scan of a tiny fetus perfectly formed against the dark background. The classic weapon of a mistress trying to stake her claim and mark her territory. Most wives would have dropped the phone in absolute horror. Most wives would have felt the air violently leave their lungs collapsed onto the hardwood floor and started screaming at the ceiling. They would have called their mothers crying uncontrollably. But my brain does not process betrayal with immediate tears. It processes raw information with cold, mechanical precision. My heart pounded against my ribs, a rapid and erratic rhythm of pure adrenaline, but my eyes immediately began dissecting the visual data in front of me. It was not just a picture of a baby meant to break my spirit. It was a digital file, and digital files always leave a trail of undeniable fingerprints. I pinched the glass screen to zoom in on the top right corner of the ultrasound printout. Madison had tried to crop the edges likely on her phone right before she sent it, but she was arrogant and careless. She was not thorough enough. I could clearly see the medical facility watermark fading into the black background of the scan. Genesis Fertility Institute. Beneath the fading watermark was a string of alphanumeric patient identification codes and a gestational age timestamp. A deep, freezing chill washed over my skin, raising the hairs on my arms. The metallic tang of fear and profound realization coated the back of my tongue. Genesis Fertility was not a normal hospital or a standard obstetrics clinic. It was the premier, highly exclusive in vitro fertilization clinic in the entire state. I knew their specific logo perfectly. I knew the patient prefix codes and their exact typography perfectly. I knew them because I had spent hundreds of agonizing hours in their sterile waiting rooms 5 years ago, praying for a miracle that Julian told me had failed. Now, looking at this stolen data, the pieces of a massive, sickening puzzle were finally locking into place. I stared at the faded logo of Genesis Fertility Institute floating in the dark corner of the ultrasound image. Genesis. The name alone sent a phantom ache radiating through my lower abdomen. I knew the sterile smell of their waiting rooms. I knew the exact shade of beige on their walls. I knew them because 5 years ago I practically lived there. Madison was young and incredibly naive. She probably thought this piece of paper was just solid proof of a sloppy office affair. She thought she was proudly carrying Julian's biological child and using it as a weapon to force me out of my own marriage. That was the first massive undeniable hole in her arrogant little trap. Because Julian is completely and irreversibly sterile. It was a devastating medical reality we discovered shortly after our beautiful wedding. His sperm count was absolute zero. For a man whose entire identity was built on aggressive alpha male dominance and the dream of building a massive corporate empire he could pass down to a miniature version of himself. The diagnosis was completely emasculating. It shattered his massive fragile ego into tiny pieces. So I did what a devoted and foolishly loyal wife does. I protected him at all costs. I buried the medical records deep inside our encrypted personal server, where no one would ever find them. I swore to him that I would never breathe a single word of his severe infertility to his abrasive, overbearing family or his cutthroat business partners. I let the world whisper that I was the one with the broken body. I took the sympathetic glances from our wealthy friends and the passive-aggressive comments from my mother-in-law with a silent smile. I absorbed all of the shame and all of the blame, so Julian could walk into his boardrooms every single day feeling like a king. Since natural conception was medically impossible, we turned to Genesis Fertility Institute. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the most elite private medical treatments available in the entire country. We carefully selected an anonymous sperm donor who perfectly matched Julian's physical profile. The donor was tall with dark hair and striking blue eyes. But the eggs were mine. They were 100% biologically mine. I endured months of grueling hormone injections that left my body bruised and my emotions highly volatile. I went through 3 agonizing egg retrieval surgeries in cold operating rooms. Finally, we received the miraculous news we had been praying for. We had successfully created 5 perfect, highly graded embryos. I remember crying tears of absolute joy while holding Julian's hands in the doctor's office. We were finally going to be parents. Then 3 weeks before our scheduled transfer date, Julian came home early from the corporate office. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. He sat me down on our living room couch and told me there had been a catastrophic equipment failure at the clinic. A backup generator had blown during a sudden power grid failure, and the cryogenic freezers in our specific sector had thawed. All 5 of our beautiful embryos were destroyed. I was utterly destroyed. I mourned those 5 unborn children with a dark, heavy grief that physically crushed my chest. Julian held me while I sobbed violently, telling me we would find another way, but we never did. He threw himself entirely into building Nova Freight, and I threw myself entirely into writing the complex code that made him incredibly rich. Now sitting entirely alone in my pristine kitchen 5 years later, I zoomed in closer on the glowing screen of my phone. I ignored the ghostly shape of the baby and focused entirely on the string of tiny white numbers printed across the top margin of the medical scan. Every single patient at Genesis has a unique alphanumeric identifier. It is a prefix code that links directly to their frozen genetic material in the database. My vision sharpened as my analytical brain took over. The blurry numbers on Madison's ultrasound were not new. The prefix was clearly visible. It was my initials followed by my exact birth month and day. It was the exact same lot number assigned to my supposedly destroyed embryos. I felt the warm blood drain completely from my face, leaving my skin ice cold and tingling. I pulled up my secure terminal window on my laptop right there on the kitchen island and immediately cross-referenced the medical data. I calculated the exact gestational age printed on the scan against the standard medical protocol for a frozen embryo transfer. The timeline matched flawlessly down to the exact day. This was not a spontaneous, careless pregnancy. This was a highly scheduled and heavily funded medically engineered procedure. Madison had not gotten pregnant by sleeping with my husband after a late-night corporate party in a hotel room. She had undergone a clinical transfer in a sterilized medical facility. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, but still, I did not shed a single tear. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Julian had not just cheated on me with his fresh-faced executive secretary. He had looked me in the eyes and lied about the freezer failure while I wept in his arms. He had intentionally kept my biological embryos frozen and hidden from me for 5 entire years. And now he had paid a corrupt doctor at Genesis Fertility to unfreeze one of my biological children and implant it into the young, healthy womb of his 24-year-old mistress. Madison was not carrying Julian's baby. She was carrying my baby, my stolen genetic child. Julian knew exactly how desperately I wanted to be a mother. He knew the grief of losing those embryos had nearly broken my spirit. But he needed a biological heir for his empire to unlock his family wealth, and he had decided I was no longer the woman he wanted to share that empire with. Instead of divorcing me fairly and splitting the massive wealth we had built together from the ground up, he had devised a sickening sociopathic plan. He was using his naive secretary as an unwitting human incubator for my biological child. He thought he could outsmart me because I loved him blindly. He thought because I worked from home in yoga pants, I was just a quiet domestic pet he could manipulate and discard whenever he pleased. He forgot who built the digital walls of his fortress. He forgot that I see absolutely everything that moves through our network. The terrified, heartbroken wife died right there on the cold marble floor of my kitchen. In her place, a chilling absolute clarity took over my entire mind. He wanted to play God with my body and my family. Now I was going to use every single piece of digital data I had to legally, permanently, and completely destroy his entire existence. Most women would have immediately dialed their husband's number. They would have screamed into the receiver until their vocal cords bled. They would have demanded an explanation or thrown fine china against the expensive kitchen walls. They would have collapsed onto the floor in a puddle of tears, letting the devastating reality of the betrayal completely wash over them. I did absolutely none of those things. I placed my phone face down on the cold marble counter. The silence in the sprawling house was deafening, but my mind was operating at 1,000 miles per hour. Confronting Julian right now would be a complete waste of precious time. He was a master manipulator and a textbook narcissist. If I called him, he would immediately spin a complex web of lies. He would gaslight me into thinking I was crazy, and then he would immediately lock me out of all our joint bank accounts, while he hired a ruthless legal team to bury me in paperwork. He would destroy all the digital evidence and paint me to the entire world as the hysterical, unstable wife who finally cracked under the immense pressure of his massive corporate success. I was absolutely not going to give him the opportunity to control the narrative. If he wanted to play a high-stakes game with my biological material and my entire future, I was going to change the rules of the board entirely. I stood up from the kitchen stool, ignoring my cold coffee, and walked calmly into my home office. I sat down at my custom-built multi-monitor workstation. This was my personal sanctuary. This was the highly advanced command center where I had single-handedly coded the foundational architecture of his entire logistics empire. I woke up my primary monitor, and the dark screen flooded my face with a harsh blue light. I pulled up a secure encrypted terminal window. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard for just a fraction of a second before I began to type. When Nova Freight began to rapidly expand a few years ago, Julian hired a massive team of expensive corporate cybersecurity experts. They strutted around the shiny new downtown office in their custom-tailored suits, bragging loudly about their impenetrable firewalls and their state-of-the-art encryption protocols. Julian told them to revoke all of my administrative access, claiming it was simply standard corporate policy, and that I needed to focus my energy on managing our sprawling new suburban estate. He essentially locked the front door to the massive digital house I had built with my own bare hands. But what Julian and his team of arrogant, highly paid tech bros completely failed to understand was that a master architect never builds a fortress without leaving a hidden exit. Before I handed over the primary root access keys 4 years ago, I buried a dormant line of administrative code deep within the central operating system. It was a phantom backdoor. It bypassed every single security protocol, every firewall, and every two-factor authentication measure they had installed. It was completely undetectable unless you knew the exact string of specialized commands to wake it up. I had never used it. I never had a single reason to until this exact moment. I typed the complex activation sequence into the black terminal window. The cursor blinked steadily like a digital heartbeat. I hit the enter key. Instantly, lines of bright green text began cascading rapidly down the screen as my system silently sliced right through Nova Freight's $1 million security infrastructure. Within 30 seconds, I had total unrestricted super user access to the entire corporate network. I was a digital ghost inside the machine, and Julian was completely blind to my presence. I did not waste time looking through his private emails or his hidden financial documents yet. That part of the destruction would come later. Right now, I needed to deliver a precise surgical strike to the one thing Julian valued above absolutely everything else in this world: his pristine public image. Nova Freight was mere weeks away from a massive initial public offering. Julian's handsome face was plastered across major financial magazines, portraying him as the brilliant, dedicated, and fiercely loyal family man, leading the tech industry into a new golden era. His stellar reputation was the most valuable asset the company possessed. I routed my connection through a secure proxy server to ensure my physical location could not be immediately traced by his incompetent IT department. Then I accessed the primary marketing and public relations dashboard. Madison was technically the primary administrator for all of the company's social media accounts. It was one of the many frivolous titles Julian had given her to justify her heavily inflated salary. Through my backdoor access, I silently commandeered her login credentials, locking her out of her own system. I linked the official Nova Freight LinkedIn page directly to the official corporate Facebook page to ensure maximum synchronized exposure across all major platforms. LinkedIn was the absolute center of Julian's professional universe. It was where his board of directors, his venture capitalist backers, and the entire logistics industry watched his every single move. A massive personal scandal broadcasted there would not just be profoundly embarrassing, it would be a catastrophic financial earthquake that would shatter his impending initial public offering. I opened a new text document to draft the perfect corporate announcement. It needed to sound exactly like the nauseatingly upbeat professional garbage that Madison usually posted on a daily basis. It needed to be cheerful, supportive, and absolutely devastating to anyone reading between the lines. My fingers flew rapidly across the keyboard as I composed the message. I typed out the exact words with cold, calculating precision. Nova Freight is thrilled to announce the upcoming expansion of our corporate family. Congratulations to Chief Executive Officer Julian and his dedicated Executive Secretary Madison on their successful in vitro fertilization journey at Genesis Fertility Institute. We love seeing teamwork extending beyond the office. It was a beautifully passive-aggressive masterpiece. It was perfectly polite, and from a legal standpoint, it was completely factual. I was simply congratulating them on their medical success. I saved the text and copied it directly to my digital clipboard. Then I retrieved the high-resolution ultrasound image Madison had so arrogantly texted me just 20 minutes prior. I uploaded the black and white scan as the primary media attachment for the post. The Genesis Fertility Institute watermark and my own personal patient identification prefix code were displayed in crystal clear high definition for anyone with a functioning brain to easily analyze. But simply posting the image and the text was not quite enough. The social media algorithm might temporarily bury it or delay its reach. I needed to ensure that the exact right people saw this immediately before Julian's panicked crisis management team had any chance to scrub it from the internet. I moved my cursor to the tagging section of the post. I started typing high-profile names. I tagged the lead managing partner of the massive venture capital firm that was aggressively underwriting their upcoming initial public offering. I tagged the senior chairman of the Nova Freight board of directors. I tagged the chief financial officer and the head of human resources. I even tagged the prominent business journalist who had recently written glowing profile pieces about Julian's supposedly flawless corporate leadership. I explicitly linked every single major player in his professional orbit directly to the undeniable image of my stolen biological child growing inside his young mistress's womb. I carefully reviewed the final draft of the post on my glowing screen. The cheerful corporate text sat in stark contrast to the horrifying medical reality of the image right below it. My pulse was completely steady. My hands were not shaking at all. I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. This was not a desperate crime of passion. This was a highly calculated demolition of a narcissistic man who genuinely thought he could play God with my life and steal my entire future. I moved the computer mouse cursor over the bright blue publish button. Julian thought sending that ultrasound image would easily break me down. He thought it would be a gentle warning that I should step aside without any resistance. He severely underestimated the quiet woman he married. I smiled at the screen, kept my silence, and firmly pressed the button. The loading circle spun for a fraction of a second before the confirmation message appeared. The post was live. The devastating truth was finally out in the open, and the countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. I did not close the terminal window after the post went live. I sat in the cold glow of my monitors and watched the digital shockwave ripple outward in real time. Because I had administrative access to the back end of the corporate network, I could see the exact engagement metrics skyrocketing by the second. For the first 2 minutes, there was nothing but a heavy digital silence. Then the notifications began. They did not start as a slow trickle. They hit my system like a catastrophic flood. My personal cell phone, which was sitting face down on the marble kitchen island, began vibrating so violently it practically danced across the stone surface. The massive venture capital investors I had tagged were awake and active. The chief financial officer of Nova Freight sent an automated panic alert through the internal company messaging system. The board of directors started an emergency group chat that was immediately flagged by my monitoring software. Within 10 short minutes, the passive-aggressive congratulations post had been shared hundreds of times across the most elite professional networks in the logistics industry. High-level executives were taking screenshots. Business journalists were furiously resharing the image. The carefully crafted illusion of Julian's perfect corporate family was disintegrating live on the internet, and there was absolutely nothing his expensive public relations team could do to stop it. They were locked out of their own accounts. I watched the traffic spike on the company website as confused shareholders tried to verify if the official page had been hacked. It had been hacked, but I used his own secretary's authorized login credentials, so the server logs would show the post came entirely from inside his own inner circle. At exactly 12 minutes past the hour, my phone screen flashed with Julian's contact photo. It was a professionally taken headshot of him, smiling confidently in a tailored suit. The image sickened me. I let it ring. The loud mechanical chime of the ringtone echoed through the empty house. He called a second time, then a third, then a fourth. He was rapid dialing me, completely abandoning his usual composed demeanor. When I refused to answer, he started leaving voicemails. I opened the visual voicemail application and pressed play on the first message. His voice filled the quiet room. He was not using the smooth, charismatic tone he used to charm older investors on golf courses. He sounded breathless, frantic, and utterly feral. He demanded to know if I was seeing the absolute disaster unfolding on the internet. He was screaming at me to find Madison and force her to delete the post. He genuinely believed that his naive little secretary had made a colossal, catastrophic mistake by uploading her own ultrasound to the public company dashboard. He had absolutely no idea that I was the one pulling the strings. The second voicemail was entirely different. By then, his crisis management team must have informed him that the network was completely locked down and that the metadata on the ultrasound image contained my specific medical identification codes. The third voicemail was just pure violent rage. He screamed my name so loudly the speaker on my phone crackled. He threatened to destroy me. He threatened to call the police. He sounded like a cornered animal realizing for the first time that the cage door had been firmly locked from the outside. I listened to his panicked breathing and felt a deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest. The arrogant king was finally bleeding. I knew he would not stay at his breakfast meeting. He would be racing back to the house in a blind rage. I had a very limited window of time to execute the final phase of my extraction. I stood up from my workstation and walked briskly to the master bedroom. I did not bother packing my expensive designer dresses or the heavy diamond jewelry he had bought me with stolen company funds. Those things were entirely worthless to me now. I pulled a simple black canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. I packed exactly 3 days' worth of comfortable clothes, a pair of running shoes, and my basic toiletries. My physical needs were completely secondary. The real treasure was in my home office. I walked back to my computer terminal and initiated a remote wipe command. A highly aggressive military-grade scrubbing program flooded the local drives, permanently erasing every single trace of my digital footprints. The screens went entirely black. I knelt beneath the heavy wooden desk and pulled open the hidden ventilation panel. Inside sat 3 heavy-duty encrypted solid-state drives. These drives contained the raw source code for Nova Freight's entire logistics routing algorithm. They contained the shadow ledgers of Julian's hidden offshore accounts. They contained the undeniable proof of his medical theft and corporate embezzlement. I carefully disconnected the drives and placed them securely into the padded compartment of my duffel bag. These small metal boxes were my leverage, my weapons, and my ultimate insurance policy. Without them, Julian was running a billion-dollar company on empty air. I zipped the bag shut and hoisted the heavy strap over my shoulder. I walked down the grand sweeping staircase of our 5,000-square-foot home for the very last time. I did not look back at the expensive modern art on the walls or the custom Italian leather furniture. This house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. I moved methodically toward the heavy oak front door. My heart rate was slow and steady. The adrenaline had completely stabilized, turning my blood into ice water. I stepped out onto the wide stone porch and locked the door firmly behind me. The crisp morning air hit my face, clearing my senses. I walked down the curved brick pathway toward my modest electric sedan parked in the wide circular driveway. Just as I opened the trunk to toss my heavy duffel bag inside, a familiar, aggressive sound shattered the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the high-pitched mechanical scream of a massive V8 engine being pushed to its absolute limit. I closed the trunk and turned around slowly. A sleek silver sports car tore around the corner of our street, ignoring the stop sign completely. The tires shrieked violently against the dark asphalt, leaving thick black marks on the pavement as the car swerved sharply into the driveway. It was Julian. He slammed on the heavy ceramic brakes, bringing the expensive vehicle to a violently sudden halt just inches from the front bumper of my car. The driver's side door flew open. I stood completely still, my hand resting casually on the roof of my car. I watched the man who had stolen my future step out of his vehicle. His face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unrestrained panic and rage. The real war had finally arrived at my front door, and I was absolutely ready to fight. I stood perfectly still next to the trunk of my electric sedan as the heavy silver sports car settled violently onto its customized suspension. The driver's side door was forcefully kicked open, and Julian stepped out into the crisp morning sun. He was a complete and utter disaster. The man who usually spent an entire hour perfecting his hair and choosing the exact right imported silk tie was currently wearing a wrinkled dress shirt completely untucked from his expensive tailored trousers. His face was flushed a deep, angry crimson, and the veins in his neck were visibly pulsing against his skin. He slammed the car door so hard the tinted glass window actually shuddered in its frame. He did not walk toward me, he marched. His expensive Italian leather shoes hit the paved brick driveway with heavy, aggressive thuds, bridging the distance between us in a matter of seconds. I kept my hand casually resting on the cool metal roof of my car, watching him approach with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a volatile and highly predictable chemical reaction. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply watched him unravel. I purposely glanced past his marching figure and looked straight through the windshield of his parked sports car. Sitting in the plush passenger seat was Madison, the arrogant 24-year-old executive secretary who had confidently sent me that ultrasound image less than an hour ago, was now violently sobbing. Her hands were covering her face, and her narrow shoulders were shaking uncontrollably. Her thick makeup was likely running down her cheeks, ruining her carefully crafted professional facade. She looked absolutely pathetic, trapped in the expensive leather seat of a car she thought would be her ticket to a lavish lifestyle. The crushing reality of her actions had finally caught up with her, and she was completely terrified. Julian stopped mere inches from my face, his chest heaving heavily as he tried to catch his breath. He smelled like stale dark roast coffee, expensive designer cologne, and pure unfiltered panic. "Give me your phone right now," he demanded. His voice was a harsh, ragged whisper that quickly escalated into a full-blown, unhinged scream echoing down the quiet suburban street. I said, "Give me the damn phone, Jessica. You need to log back into the corporate public relations portal and delete that post immediately. You need to draft a retraction. Tell everyone your account was hacked by a malicious third party. Tell them it was a coordinated cyber attack by a rival logistics competitor trying to sabotage our market value. Tell them you were sleepwalking or having a bad reaction to prescription medication. I do not care what ridiculous lie you use to cover this up, but you are going to fix this massive disaster right now." I just stared at him, my expression completely blank and unbothered. My total silence seemed to infuriate him even more, pushing him closer to the absolute edge of sanity. He reached his hand out aggressively as if he was going to physically grab the device from my coat pocket, but something in my dead cold eyes made him freeze midair. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" he yelled, spit flying from his lips and hitting the cold morning air. "You are destroying my entire logistics company. You are destroying my entire life and everything I have built over the last decade. The top-tier venture capitalists are already threatening to pull their massive funding. The board of directors is currently calling an emergency meeting to discuss my immediate suspension and potential removal as chief executive officer. We are literally weeks away from the initial public offering, weeks away from hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid assets. You are completely ruining $1 billion initial public offering over a stupid, petty domestic misunderstanding." "A petty misunderstanding," I repeated. My voice was dangerously low and completely void of any human emotion, cutting through his hysterical rant like a sharp knife. "You paid a corrupt medical doctor a massive sum of money to unfreeze my stolen biological embryo and implant it into your naive secretary so you could produce a fake genetic heir. You bypassed every single ethical and legal boundary because your fragile ego could not handle your own severe infertility. That is not a minor misunderstanding, Julian. That is a massive federal crime and a deeply sickening violation of my physical body and my trust." He flinched visibly as the heavy words hit him. The angry red color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray, as he realized I knew absolutely every single detail. He realized I had deeply analyzed the medical codes printed on the ultrasound and understood the exact timeline of his deception. But his extreme narcissism was far too deeply ingrained in his personality to allow him to feel any actual remorse or guilt for what he had done to me. Instead, his temporary panic instantly morphed into a cold, calculating cruelty. He dropped his heavy designer leather briefcase onto the brick driveway, expecting me to finally break down and submit to his overwhelming authority. "If you do not fix this right now, I will make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life begging on the streets," he snarled, stepping even closer and invading my personal space. His eyes were wide and dangerously manic, reflecting the desperate state of his crumbling empire. He pointed a shaking, angry finger directly at my face. "You think you are so incredibly smart. You think you hold all the winning cards because you figured out what happened at the fertility clinic. But you have absolutely nothing, Jessica. You own absolutely nothing in this world. This massive luxury house is entirely in my name. The luxury cars are all in my name. The entire tech company and all of its valuable intellectual property is legally in my name. You have not drawn a single corporate paycheck in 4 entire years. You have 0 personal income and 0 personal savings. You are legally a dependent unemployed housewife. I will instruct my banking managers to freeze every single joint account before lunchtime today. I will permanently cancel all of your high-limit credit cards. I will hire the most ruthless, aggressive divorce attorneys in the entire city of Chicago, and I will drag this legal battle out for decades until you cannot even afford to buy basic groceries. I will drain you emotionally and financially. I will leave you completely destitute and entirely alone." He took a deep, sharp breath, trying desperately to regain his professional composure, and smoothing his shaking hands over his wrinkled shirt. "Madison is carrying my child," he stated, his voice dripping with sickening arrogance. "She is the mother of the next generation of my powerful family. You are just a bitter, barren woman who could not give me what I needed to secure my legacy. You are going to walk right back inside that house log onto your computer and post a very public, heartfelt apology, stating that you suffered a severe mental breakdown due to marital stress. If you do that exactly as I say, I might be generous enough to leave you a very small financial settlement, so you can rent a cheap apartment. If you refuse my generous offer, I swear to God I will crush you into absolute dust." He stood there breathing heavily, fully expecting the quiet, submissive woman he had successfully controlled for years to finally surrender. He expected me to cry and beg for my financial security. Instead, I looked directly at the man I once loved and I smiled. It was not a sad or broken smile. It was a terrifying, bright, and absolutely cold smile. It was the calculated smile of an apex predator looking down at a trapped, helpless animal. I did not say a single word in response to his pathetic threats. I simply turned around, opened the heavy door of my electric sedan, and slid gracefully into the comfortable driver's seat. Julian leaned down, grabbing the painted frame of my open window, his face contorted in deep confusion and escalating rage. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. I looked him dead in the eyes and pressed the window control button. The thick glass rolled up smoothly and quickly, forcing him to instantly snatch his fingers away before they were violently crushed against the frame. I pressed the start button and the silent electric engine hummed to life. I shifted the car into reverse. I did not bother checking my rearview mirrors. I just pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator. The heavy tires of my sedan rolled forcefully backward directly over his expensive drop leather briefcase. I heard the incredibly satisfying crunch of his glass tablet screen and his luxury fountain pen snapping violently under the massive weight of my vehicle. Julian screamed in anger and shock, jumping backward to avoid getting hit by the front bumper. I smoothly shifted the transmission into drive, turned the leather steering wheel sharply, and glided effortlessly out of the long driveway, leaving him standing entirely alone in the street, staring at his ruined briefcase while his panicked mistress continued to sob in the passenger seat. I navigated the heavy electric sedan through the winding suburban streets, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the shattered remains of Julian's fragile ego. My rearview mirror was finally completely empty. The intense rush of adrenaline that had spiked during the chaotic driveway confrontation slowly began to recede, leaving behind a cold state of hyper-focused clarity. I did not drive toward the international airport or a random expensive hotel just yet. I needed a highly secure public wireless network, and I needed a quiet place to execute the very next phase of my carefully planned strategy. I drove into the crowded parking lot of an upscale independent coffee shop, located on the busy edge of the downtown financial district. The morning rush hour crowd was in full swing. Men and women in expensive tailored business suits were rushing past my parked car, completely oblivious to the massive corporate war I was currently waging from the front seat of my vehicle. I parked the car in a secluded corner spot, completely hidden under the dark shade of a large oak tree, and turned off the silent engine. I reached into my black canvas duffel bag and pulled out my secondary encrypted laptop. This specific machine was completely untraceable. It was a digital ghost device I had custom-built specifically for absolute worst-case emergencies. I connected the laptop to the coffee shop's wireless network using a heavy-duty military-grade virtual private network to completely mask my physical location. Just as the secure connection was fully established, my cell phone lit up like a flashing slot machine. A rapid-fire barrage of automated text messages and urgent email alerts completely flooded my digital screen. I picked up the heavy device and read through the long list of notifications with a calm, detached amusement. Julian was being entirely predictable. He was executing the exact desperate playbook of a narcissistic man, trying to aggressively regain total control through financial abuse. The very first alert was from our primary high-wealth management bank. My administrative access to our massive joint checking and savings accounts had been officially and permanently revoked. The massive balances, which held over $3 million in liquid cash, were completely frozen and invisible to my user profile. A fraction of a second later, my digital wallet application sent a cascading wave of red notifications. My primary platinum credit card was instantly declined. My secondary emergency card was officially reported stolen. My corporate expense account was permanently deactivated by the finance department. Julian had frantically called every single financial institution we actively used and systematically starved me of every single dollar to my name. He genuinely thought he had just brutally cut off my only oxygen supply. He thought I was currently sitting in my car, panicking, crying uncontrollably, and wondering how I was going to afford a basic hotel room or a cheap meal. He truly believed he had successfully reduced me to a helpless dependent housewife, who would have absolutely no choice but to crawl right back to him and beg for financial mercy. I sat in the quiet leather interior of my car, staring blankly at the long, depressing list of zeroed-out accounts, and I actually laughed out loud. The sound was incredibly bright and sharp, echoing loudly off the windows. It was the genuine laugh of a woman who had spent 4 entire years silently and meticulously building the exact steel cage her enemy was currently standing inside. Julian was a brilliantly charismatic salesman, but he was fundamentally illiterate when it came to complex back-end financial architecture. When Nova Freight was just a struggling, pathetic tech startup operating out of our cramped apartment living room, he could not afford to hire a massive professional accounting firm. He begged me to design and implement the entire digital financial infrastructure from scratch. I built the complex payroll systems, the automated vendor payment portals, and the secure routing algorithms that currently handled millions of dollars in high-volume logistics contracts. But I was never just a supportive, loving wife, helping out for absolutely free. I was a senior data architect with a meticulous understanding of ruthless corporate law. Years ago, before the tech company ever reached a massive public valuation, I had quietly drafted an ironclad, legally binding corporate service agreement. I legally categorized myself not as a domestic partner, but as a senior independent technical contractor. I set my professional billing rate at an extremely high premium, perfectly reflecting my elite industry expertise. Every single month for 4 entire years, my automated background system generated a highly detailed invoice for my specialized maintenance services. And every single month, because Julian wanted to greedily reinvest all the available cash flow into aggressive corporate expansion, those massive invoices went completely unpaid. I never complained. I never brought it up at dinner. I simply let the massive corporate debt quietly accumulate in the deepest hidden layers of the secure financial ledger. Julian thought he owned all the real money because his signature was printed on the shiny plastic credit cards. He did not understand that I completely owned the actual digital pipes the money flowed through. I opened a specialized command terminal window on my laptop and directly accessed the Nova Freight corporate vendor payment gateway. I did not use my old dependent wife login credentials. I logged into the system using my highly secure independent contractor credentials. The dashboard immediately populated, showing a staggering red outstanding balance. Julian legally owed me exactly $2.5 million in unpaid back pay and accrued penalty late fees. But I was absolutely not going to send him a polite formal collection letter. When I originally built the vendor payment system, I intentionally integrated a highly aggressive automated smart contract protocol designed to protect the company from delinquent shipping clients. Now I was going to ruthlessly use that exact same protocol against him. I initiated a direct commercial lien against Nova Freight's primary operational bank accounts. This was not a slow, drawn-out legal process that required a judge or a crowded courtroom. This was a hard-coded, unchangeable financial trigger. I typed in my unique administrative authorization key and pressed execute. The smart contract instantly deployed across the network. It completely bypassed his wealthy bankers and his expensive team of corporate lawyers. It immediately placed a mandatory legal freeze on every single dollar inside the Nova Freight operating accounts until my massive vendor debt was fully and completely satisfied. I watched the progress bar on my bright screen fill with a solid green light. In less than 60 seconds, the massive logistics empire was entirely financially paralyzed. Julian could not pay his massive shipping vendors. He could not pay his fleet of truck drivers. He could not even pay the electricity bill for his shiny downtown corporate headquarters. He had tried to lock me out of a checking account to teach me a lesson about power. In return, I just locked him completely out of his own billion-dollar company. I closed my laptop with a highly satisfying click and safely placed it back inside my canvas bag. I smiled, knowing his destruction was legally absolute. I drove my heavy electric sedan away from the bustling coffee shop and navigated toward the affluent heart of downtown Chicago. Julian had successfully executed his pathetic attempt to financially starve me by freezing our shared bank accounts and canceling all of my high-limit platinum credit cards. He genuinely believed he had trapped me in a desperate corner. He severely underestimated the quiet woman who controlled his entire digital infrastructure. Years ago, when Nova Freight secured its very first massive logistics contract, I diverted a carefully calculated percentage of my independent consulting fees into a deeply hidden private banking account. It was an encrypted offshore entity entirely in my maiden name, completely invisible to his elite team of high-wealth managers. I pulled my vehicle into the circular driveway of the most exclusive luxury hotel in the entire city. The uniformed valet rushed forward to open my car door. I handed him the heavy key fob along with a crisp $100 bill for my emergency cash reserve. I walked gracefully through the grand marble lobby, ignoring the stares of the wealthy patrons, and approached the polished mahogany front desk. I did not use my married name. I secured their most expensive premier penthouse suite and paid for an entire month in advance using a secure digital wire transfer from my hidden offshore account. The penthouse suite was a sprawling masterpiece of modern sterile architecture, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a commanding panoramic view of the dark, choppy waters of Lake Michigan. It was an impenetrable luxury fortress, floating high above the absolute chaos I had just unleashed upon Julian's crumbling empire. I dropped my black canvas duffel bag onto the thick, custom-woven silk rug and immediately moved toward the massive glass dining table. I needed to establish my digital command center to monitor the catastrophic financial gridlock I had triggered against his corporate operating accounts. I retrieved my encrypted laptop and connected to the high-speed wireless network using a military-grade virtual private network protocol to completely mask my physical location. I poured myself a tall glass of cold, sparkling water from the expensive minibar and took a long, slow sip, feeling the crisp liquid soothe my dry throat. The profound silence in the massive room was absolute and incredibly comforting. I was completely safe and entirely in control. Suddenly, my secondary burner phone vibrated violently against the thick glass tabletop. This was a highly secure prepaid device I had purchased months ago, strictly for emergency two-factor authentication protocols. Only a handful of critical automated server systems possess this exact routing number. The bright digital screen illuminated, displaying an incoming call from an unregistered private number. I placed my water glass down on the table and picked up the heavy device. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the phone to my ear without speaking a single syllable. "Well, well, well, if it is not the angry little runaway wife." The voice echoing through the small speaker was painfully familiar, but the tone was entirely different. It was Madison. The pathetic, terrified girl who had been violently sobbing into her hands in the passenger seat of Julian's sports car just an hour ago was completely gone. In her place was a vicious, arrogant woman dripping with sheer malice and unearned confidence. I could clearly hear the loud ambient noise of a busy upscale restaurant in the background. She was likely sitting at a luxury lunch spot, spending what she thought was Julian's endless money to comfort her own frayed nerves. I remained entirely silent, letting her arrogant voice fill the empty air of my quiet penthouse suite. She incorrectly took my silence as a sign of complete emotional weakness and eagerly continued her venomous attack. "Julian told me you completely lost your mind this morning," she sneered, her voice dripping with pure toxic poison. "He told me you threw a massive hysterical tantrum in the driveway and drove off like a complete psychopath. You really thought posting that fake picture would ruin us, did you not? You thought you could publicly embarrass me and force Julian to come crawling back to your pathetic empty home. You are so incredibly delusional, Jessica. Julian does not love you. He has not loved you in years. He is absolutely disgusted by your very presence." I kept my breathing perfectly steady, and listened closely as she continued to aggressively dig her own grave. "You are nothing but a washed-up, barren failure." Madison hissed, her tone growing even more aggressive and nasty with every single word. "You could not even perform the most basic biological function of a real woman. You could not give him the one thing he desperately needed, so he came to me. I am young, and I am beautiful, and I am healthy. I am giving him the exact thing you could never ever provide. I am carrying his biological son. I am the mother of his true heir. He chose me, and he is going to make sure you are left out on the cold street with absolutely nothing, while I become the new powerful queen of his massive empire." I felt a sharp, cold spike of pure analytical focus pierce through my calm mind. Something about her frantic, arrogant gloating did not align with the established logical facts. Madison was incredibly arrogant, but she was also deeply stupid. She was clearly parroting specific phrases that Julian had intentionally fed her to keep her perfectly compliant. I listened intently, analyzing every single syllable she spoke, waiting patiently for the inevitable critical error. "You think freezing a few little corporate bank accounts is going to stop him?" She laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed unpleasantly in my ear. "You are so incredibly stupid. Julian does not even care about that petty cash right now. We are completely untouchable. Once this baby is born, we finally unlock the ironclad trust fund." Julian explained absolutely everything to me. $50 million is completely guaranteed the very second I deliver his healthy son. You are just a pathetic minor inconvenience standing in the way of our massive generational wealth. So go ahead and hide in whatever cheap motel you found. We are taking the entire trust fund, and you are getting absolutely nothing." The line went completely dead. She hung up the phone, genuinely feeling like she had just delivered a fatal emotional blow to my fragile psyche. But instead of crying, I slowly lowered the burner phone to the glass table and smiled a deeply predatory smile. Madison had just unknowingly handed me the most critical missing piece of the entire massive puzzle: the ironclad trust fund. I had completely and thoroughly audited Julian's personal and corporate finances for 4 entire years. I knew every single hidden asset, every offshore shell company, and every real estate investment in his massive financial portfolio. There was absolutely no $50 million trust fund listed in any of his known legal records. If Julian was aggressively expecting a massive $50 million payout contingent entirely upon the birth of a biological heir, it meant the money was heavily tied to an external source. It meant it was directly tied to his deeply secretive aristocratic family. The same overbearing, arrogant family that had always treated me with polite disdain at holiday dinners. The same family whose late grandfather had built a massive logistics empire before passing away quietly a decade ago. The timeline suddenly made terrifying and perfect sense. Julian had not just stolen my biological embryo out of some twisted narcissistic desire to have a beautiful child. He had stolen my biological embryo because he was facing an impending, legally binding deadline to unlock a massive fortune. He needed a baby desperately, and he needed it right now. My pulse quickened with the pure intellectual thrill of the hunt. Julian thought he was playing a brilliant game of 3-dimensional chess, successfully manipulating both me and his naive little mistress to secure his massive inheritance. He thought he had successfully hidden his true dark motive behind the emotional facade of a tragic fertility struggle. But Madison, in her desperate attempt to assert her dominance, had completely shattered his heavy veil of secrecy. I opened a new, highly secure search window on my laptop. I did not need to cry over her cruel, uneducated insults about my physical body. I was far too busy preparing to legally and financially execute both of them. I began typing complex search queries, attempting to access sealed probate court records and heavily encrypted family estate filings. I needed to discover the exact legal parameters and expiration dates of that hidden trust fund. And to do that, I was going to need highly specialized legal access. I was going to need an insider who hated Julian just as much as I did. I was deep into my secure search queries, cross-referencing state probate databases, when a heavy sound shattered the absolute silence of my penthouse suite. It was a loud, authoritative knock striking the thick, solid wood of my hotel room door. It was not the soft, polite tap of room service delivering fresh towels or a catered lunch. It was the aggressive, rhythmic pounding of someone who fully expected the door to be opened immediately. I closed my encrypted laptop screen, securing the digital command center, and stood up from the glass dining table. My bare feet made absolutely no sound against the plush silk rug as I walked slowly toward the entryway. I did not feel fear, but my heart rate naturally elevated, pumping fresh adrenaline through my veins. Julian was incredibly fast. I had paralyzed his corporate operating accounts less than an hour ago, and he was already executing his next desperate counterattack. I leaned forward and looked through the small brass peephole. Standing in the carpeted hallway were two large uniformed police officers. One of them had his hand resting casually on his heavy-duty utility belt right next to his standard-issue firearm. Julian was a wealthy, powerful white man in a major city, and he knew exactly how to weaponize law enforcement against a woman he wanted to silence. He knew that calling the police and fabricating a violent domestic dispute was the fastest way to get me physically detained and stripped of my digital devices. I took a deep, steadying breath to completely calm my nervous system. I smoothed the wrinkles from my simple black shirt, unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt, and pulled the door open with a perfectly practiced expression of mild, polite confusion. "Good afternoon, officers," I said, my voice completely steady and entirely pleasant. "How can I help you today?" The older officer stepped forward, his posture rigid and deeply suspicious. "Are you Jessica?" he asked, his eyes scanning my face, and then looking past my shoulder into the sprawling luxury suite. "We received a highly urgent dispatch call from your husband, Julian. He reported a severe domestic disturbance at your primary residence this morning. He stated that you became physically violent, destroyed his personal property, and then fled the scene in a manic state. He also reported that you committed massive corporate espionage by stealing highly sensitive proprietary computer hardware belonging to his logistics company, Nova Freight. He claims you are currently holding millions of dollars of intellectual property hostage on a stolen company laptop." I listened to the ridiculous, fabricated charges with a perfectly blank expression. Julian had spun a masterful cinematic lie to trigger an immediate aggressive police response. He wanted me thrown into the back of a squad car with my hands handcuffed behind my back so he could easily confiscate my encrypted hard drives and regain total control of his crumbling empire. I did not raise my voice or act defensive. Women who scream and cry to the police are instantly labeled as hysterical and uncooperative. I needed to be the absolute picture of cold, rational corporate professionalism. "I completely understand why you are here, officer," I replied, my tone gentle but incredibly firm. "But my husband is currently experiencing a massive financial crisis, and he is unfortunately attempting to use your department to illegally resolve a civil corporate dispute. I am not a violent domestic threat, and I absolutely did not steal any company property. Please step inside for just one moment so I can provide you with the exact legal documentation proving my absolute ownership of the hardware in question." The officers exchanged a highly skeptical glance, but they slowly stepped into the marble entryway of my suite. I walked calmly back to the glass dining table and opened my black canvas duffel bag. I did not reach for my encrypted computer. Instead, I pulled out a thick manila folder containing hard copies of my most critical legal contracts. I always kept physical backups because digital files could be easily manipulated in a chaotic legal battle. I handed the heavy folder directly to the older officer. "If you look at the second page, you will clearly see my legally binding corporate service agreement." I explained, pointing to the highlighted sections of the dense legal text. "I am not a standard employee of Nova Freight. I am the senior independent data architect who built their entire digital infrastructure. The specific laptop my husband claims I stole is legally registered to my personal limited liability company, not his logistics firm. The proprietary software on that machine was written entirely by me, and the intellectual property rights belong exclusively to my corporate entity. My husband is currently attempting to unlawfully seize my private business assets because I recently initiated a massive legal lien against his operating accounts for $2.5 million in unpaid vendor invoices." The older officer carefully read through the highlighted paragraphs. His expression slowly shifted from aggressive suspicion to deep irritation. He handed the thick folder to his younger partner, who also quickly scanned the undeniable legal language. They realized instantly that they had been manipulated by a wealthy, arrogant chief executive officer trying to use the local police department as his own personal collection agency. This is clearly a complex civil matter regarding corporate property and contract disputes. The older officer stated his tone entirely different now. Your husband had absolutely no right to dispatch us under the false pretense of a violent domestic emergency. We will be making a direct phone call to Julian to strongly advise him against filing any more false police reports, because that is a serious criminal offense. I thanked them graciously and walked them back to the heavy wooden door. As the heavy latch clicked shut securely, locking them out in the hallway, the polite smile immediately vanished from my face. My entire body felt strangely cold. Julian was escalating the situation far faster and far more recklessly than I had originally anticipated. He was perfectly willing to weaponize the criminal justice system to completely destroy my life. My highly advanced computer skills and my ironclad corporate contracts were incredibly powerful defensive shields, but they were absolutely not enough to fight a fully funded legal war against a man willing to commit blatant perjury to the police. I needed a completely different type of weapon. I needed someone who understood the deep, dark inner workings of his family empire. I needed an insider who possessed massive legal authority. I needed his adopted African-American brother Marcus immediately. I knew exactly who to call. I did not reach out to a standard divorce attorney who would charge me a massive hourly rate to negotiate a pathetic settlement. I needed someone on the inside of the Nova Freight empire. I needed the chief legal counsel. I opened my burner phone and dialed a highly secure number. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. I simply gave him the address of a quiet, dimly lit club on the south side of the city and told him I would be sitting in the back booth in exactly 1 hour. An hour later, I was sitting in the dark leather booth. The soundproof door opened slowly. Marcus stepped into the dim light. Marcus was Julian's adopted brother and the razor-sharp legal mind that kept the entire Nova Freight logistics empire compliant with federal laws. He was a tall, striking African-American man in his late 30s, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that commanded absolute respect. The wealthy family had adopted him when he was 7 years old, but they always treated him as an outsider. Julian was the arrogant biological child who was handed every advantage, while Marcus fought aggressively for his massive success. Despite his brilliant legal degree, Julian constantly talked down to him, treating his brother like a servant rather than an equal partner. Marcus despised Julian's reckless narcissism, but stayed fiercely loyal to the company to protect the legacy of their late grandfather, who was the only family member that ever treated him with genuine respect. Marcus walked over to my booth and slid onto the leather seat. He placed his expensive briefcase on the table and let out a heavy sigh. His dark eyes locked onto mine, and I saw a genuine spark of solidarity. "You have officially started a massive corporate world war, Jessica," he said, his deep voice echoing slightly. "My phone has been ringing continuously. The board of directors is panicking. The venture capitalists are threatening to pull the initial public offering. Julian is currently running around the downtown office screaming and firing technology employees because he thinks the main servers were breached by a foreign entity. I saw the viral social media post. I know you did it. It was a brilliant and utterly ruthless tactical strike. I am honestly surprised you waited this long to burn his fragile ego to the ground." I kept my expression perfectly calm and pushed a heavy glass of bourbon toward him. "I did not bring you here to gloat about a successful public relations sabotage," I replied softly. "Julian is completely predictable. He already tried to financially freeze me out of all our joint accounts, and less than an hour ago he sent the police to my hotel room trying to have me arrested on fabricated domestic violence charges. He is violently escalating the situation to protect his reputation, and I need a massive legal shield. But more importantly, I need you to understand exactly why I uploaded that specific picture." Marcus picked up the crystal glass and took a slow, measured sip. He furrowed his brow, clearly confused. "You posted the ultrasound because he got his 24-year-old secretary pregnant," he stated. "It is the classic arrogant billionaire cliché. He humiliated you, so you publicly humiliated him and tanked his initial public offering. What else is there to thoroughly understand? I pulled out my secondary encrypted laptop. I flipped the screen open and turned the monitor so it faced him directly. I brought up the raw digital image file of the ultrasound and zoomed in heavily on the top right corner. Look closely at the medical facility watermark I instructed, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. Look at the specific alphanumeric patient identification codes printed directly beneath the date stamp. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His sharp legal mind instantly began processing the complex data. He read the letters and the numbers out loud. Then he froze completely. The bourbon glass in his hand shook slightly. He looked up at me, his expression shifting rapidly to absolute undeniable horror. "Jessica," he whispered, his voice incredibly tight. "These are your exact personal initials. This is your exact birth date. This is a secure medical profile code for the Genesis Fertility Institute. But Julian told the entire family years ago that your frozen biological embryos were destroyed in a catastrophic equipment failure. He lied to me, and he lied to your entire family," I stated flatly. "Julian is completely sterile. His sperm count is 0. We used an anonymous donor to create those perfect embryos, and they were never destroyed. He secretly paid a corrupt medical doctor at the clinic to keep them perfectly preserved. And now he has illegally paid that exact same doctor to unfreeze one of my biological children and medically implant it into the young womb of his naive secretary. Madison is not carrying Julian's biological baby. She is carrying my stolen genetic child. He orchestrated a massive federal crime simply because he wanted to replace me without losing his precious corporate assets in a messy divorce." Marcus stared at the glowing computer screen for a very long time. The absolute silence in the private club was heavy and suffocating. When he finally looked back up at me, the professional corporate lawyer was completely gone. In his place was a man radiating pure, unfiltered, absolute rage. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing, and his jaw was clenched tightly. He had spent his entire life putting up with Julian's petty arrogance and careless financial mistakes, but this was an entirely different level of sociopathic evil. This was a direct, violent violation of human life and basic medical ethics. "I am going to personally destroy him," Marcus said, his voice vibrating with absolute certainty. "I do not care about the logistics company anymore. I do not care about the initial public offering or the wealthy venture capitalists. Julian crossed a line that cannot ever be uncrossed. I am the chief legal counsel of this empire, and I know exactly where every single one of his dark secrets is buried. I know the shell companies he uses to hide his stolen money. I have total, unrestricted access to the sealed estate files of our late grandfather. We are not just going to divorce him, Jessica. We are going to legally, financially, and publicly obliterate him. We will ensure he spends his life rotting inside a federal penitentiary." I felt a dark, satisfying relief wash over my body. I slowly closed the laptop screen and extended my right hand across the wooden table. Marcus reached out and gripped my hand firmly, sealing our devastating alliance. The arrogant king of the logistics world thought he was playing a private game of chess against a helpless housewife. He had no idea that his own brilliant brother and the master architect of his entire digital infrastructure had just officially joined forces to orchestrate his total, absolute, and permanent destruction. The real war was finally about to begin. Marcus reached down to the floor of the private club and lifted his heavy leather briefcase onto the dark wooden table. His hands moved with precise, practiced movements as he spun the brass combination locks. The heavy latches sprang open with a sharp metallic click. He did not pull out stacks of dusty paper. He pulled out a sleek, matte black tablet. This device was completely isolated from the standard corporate network of Nova Freight. It was his personal secure terminal directly linked to the most highly classified legal archives of his family estate. He woke the screen and typed in a complex sequence of passwords and biometric verifications. The blue light from the tablet illuminated his sharp features, casting long shadows across the dark leather booth. Our late grandfather was a notoriously paranoid and incredibly demanding man. Marcus explained, his deep voice barely rising above a whisper. He built this massive logistics empire from absolute scratch, and he fiercely protected his wealth. He knew Julian was incredibly charismatic, But he also knew Julian was reckless, deeply arrogant, and entirely driven by superficial greed. Before the old man passed away a decade ago, he restructured his massive estate. He left the operational control of the company to Julian because he needed a charismatic face for the board of directors. But he completely locked away the actual liquid wealth. He created a highly secretive generation-skipping trust fund. Marcus tapped the glass screen, navigating through layers of encrypted digital folders until he reached a heavily redacted legal document. The file was labeled with a strict non-disclosure agreement and a heavy digital seal from the state probate court. I have been the chief legal counsel for years, but even I am legally barred from modifying this specific trust. Marcus continued. It is absolutely ironclad. Julian has been obsessed with unlocking this money since the day the old man died. I never paid close attention to the specific medical stipulations, because Julian always claimed he simply wanted to wait for the perfect time to start a family. But your terrifying timeline changes absolutely everything. Marcus turned the glowing tablet toward me. He pointed a long finger at a dense paragraph buried deep within the third section of the complex legal document. I leaned forward and read the black text glowing brightly against the white background. The legal language was thick and archaic, but the meaning was brutally and undeniably clear. Upon the legally verified birth of the first direct biological child of Julian, the trust fund shall immediately release the total sum of $50 million in tax-free liquid assets to his direct personal control. I read the sentence 3 times, feeling the heavy weight of the massive dollar amount sink completely into my brain. $50 million. It was a staggering amount of hidden wealth. But there was another crucial sentence located immediately below the payout clause. If Julian fails to produce a living biological heir by the exact date of his 35th birthday, the entire principal balance of the trust fund shall automatically permanently default to a designated list of charitable organizations. He will receive absolutely nothing. I stared at the glowing screen as the massive puzzle completely clicked into place. The horrific truth hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. Julian's 35th birthday was exactly 4 weeks away. I felt a sudden sickening wave of absolute clarity wash over my entire mind. Julian was completely sterile, and he knew it. He had known it for years. As his 35th birthday rapidly approached, the terrifying reality of losing $50 million must have completely consumed his greedy sociopathic mind. He could not adopt a child because the trust legally required a direct biological heir. He could not naturally impregnate a mistress because his biological systems were entirely broken. He was completely out of options and running entirely out of time. That is why he suddenly started taking an aggressive interest in my old medical files 2 months ago. I whispered, my voice completely cold and devoid of any human emotion. I thought he was just casually organizing our safe, but he was looking for the exact clinic identification codes. He knew I still had those perfect viable embryos frozen in a secure nitrogen tank at Genesis Fertility Institute. They were 50% his matching donor and 50% me. They were legally and scientifically the closest thing he could ever produce to a biological child. Marcus nodded, his expression extremely grim. He needed a baby right now to hit the strict legal deadline and secure the $50 million. But he absolutely did not want to share that massive fortune with you. He is a textbook narcissist. If you carried the baby and gave birth as his legal wife, you would legally be entitled to half of that incredible wealth in the event of a divorce. He wanted the absolute entire fortune for himself, so he devised a truly monstrous plan. He stole your biological property. He bribed a corrupt medical professional. And he used his naive young secretary as an oblivious human incubator. Madison is just a disposable pawn, I said, staring blankly at the dark wooden table. She genuinely thinks he is madly in love with her. She thinks she is carrying his biological child and securing her permanent place as the wealthy queen of his logistics empire. But the second she gives birth, and that trust fund legally unlocks, Julian will completely discard her. He will hire a team of ruthless corporate lawyers to take full custody of the child, claiming she is an unfit mother. He will pay her off with a tiny fraction of the money and throw her out onto the street. He gets the baby, he gets the $50 million, and he completely eliminates me from the equation by framing me for his corporate embezzlement. It was a masterpiece of pure, unadulterated evil. Julian had orchestrated a massive multi-million-dollar heist using human lives as his playing pieces. He had violated my physical body, my trust, and my marriage solely to secure a hidden inheritance. He thought he was the smartest man in the entire world. He thought he had successfully manipulated the medical system, the legal system, and the two women in his life to achieve his ultimate victory. But he made one catastrophic miscalculation. He severely underestimated the woman he married. He forgot that I was the one who built the complex digital systems he relied on every single day. And he completely forgot that his own brilliant brother had access to the very legal documents he was desperately trying to exploit. I looked up from the glowing tablet and met Marcus's dark, intense eyes. "We are not just going to stop him from getting the money." I stated, my voice as hard and cold as solid steel. "We are going to let him believe he is winning. We are going to let him stand under the brightest lights on the biggest stage of his entire life, thinking he is finally about to grab that massive prize. And then we are going to drop the floor right out from under him. We are going to use this exact legal document to ensure he loses his company, his freedom, and his entire future." Marcus slowly closed the black leather cover of his tablet. "I will begin drafting the federal subpoenas tonight," he replied, his tone matching my absolute resolve. "We will freeze the trust fund and flag the medical theft with the federal authorities. Julian thinks he is playing a simple game of checkers. We are going to show him what a brutal game of chess actually looks like." We knew exactly why Julian had orchestrated this sickening biological theft, but a massive piece of the criminal puzzle was still completely missing. Genesis Fertility Institute was not a shady back alley medical clinic operating out of a strip mall. It was a highly regulated premier medical facility with massive overhead, strict federal oversight, and an entire team of legal compliance officers. Bribing a top-tier specialist to completely bypass strict bioethical laws and unfreeze a stolen embryo without the legally required written consent of the biological mother would require an astronomical amount of untraceable cash. Julian was a very wealthy man on paper, but his personal finances were heavily tied up in corporate stock options and highly monitored joint wealth management accounts. He could not simply write a personal check for a black market medical procedure of this terrifying magnitude. He needed liquid capital, and he needed it entirely off the official books. I looked across the dark table at Marcus, who was already nodding in silent agreement as my mind raced through the complex logistical realities of the crime. If Julian needed massive amounts of untraceable cash, there was only one place he could realistically steal it from, without immediately triggering a massive internal audit. He had to be stealing directly from the operating accounts of Nova Freight. I pulled my heavy encrypted laptop closer to the edge of the table and opened a new secure terminal window. This time, I was not just using my secret administrative backdoor to sneak through the digital shadows. I had the chief legal counsel sitting right across from me, granting me complete legally authorized access to the absolute deepest financial layers of the logistics empire. Marcus leaned forward and typed his unique senior executive credentials into my keyboard, unlocking the highly restricted shadow ledgers that were completely hidden from the standard accounting department. These were the raw, unedited data streams where massive corporate funds moved before they were officially sanitized and dressed up for the quarterly shareholder reports. The bright screen filled with endless rows of highly complex transactional data illuminating our faces in the dim club. I wrote the foundational code for this massive financial architecture 4 years ago. So navigating the complex digital maze was exactly like walking through the familiar halls of my own house. I immediately bypassed the standard daily operational accounts and targeted the largest, most fluid capital pool in the entire logistics company, the multi-million-dollar research and development budget. Julian had been aggressively touting a massive new artificial intelligence routing algorithm to the greedy venture capitalists, claiming it would completely revolutionize the entire global shipping industry. He had successfully secured tens of millions of dollars, specifically earmarked for this supposedly revolutionary technological research. I ran a highly targeted diagnostic sweep, writing a custom sorting script on the fly, to search for any financial anomalies within the massive research and development expenditure logs. Within seconds, the system flashed red and flagged a massive series of highly irregular outbound wire transfers. Over the past 6 months, exactly coinciding with the precise timeline of Madison's sudden unexpected pregnancy, Julian had quietly authorized 12 separate automated payments of $500,000 each. $6 million had been completely drained from the legitimate corporate research budget, but the massive sums of money were absolutely not going to legitimate software developers or international technology consulting firms. I highlighted the suspicious routing numbers and immediately initiated a deep trace protocol. Julian had tried to be incredibly clever by using a complex series of digital tumblers to wash the stolen corporate money. He routed the massive funds through 3 separate untraceable shell companies, officially registered in the British Virgin Islands. To a standard internal corporate auditor, the transactions looked exactly like legitimate expensive payments for outsourced foreign technology consulting. But Julian completely forgot that I personally built the very financial tracking algorithms he was desperately trying to evade. I stripped away the fake corporate layers one by one, peeling back his pathetic digital disguise to expose the true final destination of the violently embezzled funds. The money was quietly being funneled directly back into the United States, into 2 highly specific private bank accounts. The first destination account belonged to an elite private wealth management firm right here in Chicago. Marcus immediately cross-referenced the account routing number with his massive subscription legal databases. His jaw tightened instantly as the verified ownership records populated on his secure tablet screen. The private offshore account belonged entirely to Dr. Harrison Vance, the senior reproductive endocrinologist and primary medical director of Genesis Fertility Institute. Julian had paid him exactly $2.5 million in completely untraceable laundered cash to commit a massive, terrifying federal crime. He had bought a premier medical doctor to act as his personal biological thief. The second destination of the stolen research funds was even more infuriating and arrogant. The remaining $3.5 million had been wired directly to an elite luxury real estate brokerage firm operating in the city. Marcus pulled up the corresponding property deed from the county public records database. Julian had not just paid for the illegal medical procedure. He had used the stolen corporate venture capital funds to purchase a sprawling luxury penthouse in the most expensive high-rise building in downtown Chicago. And the deed was registered entirely in Madison's name. I sat back against the dark leather booth, feeling the absolute heavy gravity of the massive financial crimes staring back at us from the glowing digital screens. Julian had not simply engaged in a desperate personal cover-up to save his fragile ego. He had completely gutted the primary research budget of his own logistics empire, lying directly to his aggressive venture capitalist investors, his own board of directors, and the federal government. He was committing massive corporate wire fraud, international money laundering, and medical embezzlement, all to successfully secure a hidden $50 million family trust fund. He had built an incredible fragile house of cards out of stolen corporate money and stolen human biology. Marcus looked at me, his dark eyes burning with an intense predatory satisfaction. Julian is not just going to lose his chief executive title for this, Marcus said, his deep voice deadly serious. The Securities and Exchange Commission will bring massive federal racketeering charges. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will seize his entire personal portfolio and freeze every single asset he has ever touched. He is going to spend the next 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I nodded slowly, a cold, highly calculated smile forming on my face. Julian thought he was an untouchable king playing a brilliant game of high-stakes corporate chess. But he was just a pathetic, desperate thief who had left a massive glowing digital trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to his own absolute public destruction. We could not simply walk into the local police precinct and report a multi-million-dollar medical theft using only a collection of flagged digital wire transfers and a hacked social media photograph. We needed highly undeniable physical evidence. We needed the original forged consent forms and the absolute proof of the black market transaction completely signed and dated in solid ink. We needed to pay a surprise visit to the Genesis Fertility Institute before Julian had the opportunity to physically destroy the paper trail. Marcus and I left the dark private club and immediately drove my electric sedan across the sprawling city toward the affluent northern suburbs. We did not speak during the drive. The heavy silence in the car was thick with intense, focused anticipation. We were two highly skilled professionals executing a massive corporate raid on a corrupt medical facility. The Genesis Fertility Institute was located in a massive modern glass building, surrounded by perfectly manicured green lawns and tall, expensive privacy hedges. It did not look like a standard hospital. It looked like an elite country club designed specifically for the ultra-wealthy. We walked through the heavy automated sliding glass doors and stepped into the sprawling bright white lobby. The air smelled strongly of expensive sterile cleaning solutions and fresh-cut lilies. A young receptionist sitting behind a massive curved marble desk looked up and offered a practiced, sympathetic smile. "Welcome to Genesis Fertility," she said, her voice soft and highly professional. "How can I help you today?" Marcus did not smile back. He did not slow his confident, aggressive stride. He walked directly up to the massive marble desk and placed his heavy leather briefcase flat on the polished surface. "I am Marcus, the Chief Legal Counsel for Nova Freight Logistics." He stated, his deep voice echoing loudly through the quiet, pristine lobby. "And this is Jessica, the primary biological donor for patient file Alpha 739. We are not here for a standard medical consultation. We are here to see Dr. Harrison Vance immediately." The young receptionist's perfectly practiced smile instantly faltered. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized my name and the incredibly high-profile corporate title Marcus had just deployed. "I am so sorry, sir, but Dr. Vance is currently in a highly secure private consultation," she stammered, her hands fluttering nervously over her computer keyboard. "He absolutely does not take unannounced walk-in appointments. If you would like to schedule a formal meeting for next week, I can certainly check his availability." Marcus leaned forward, his massive frame completely dominating the space, and his dark eyes locking aggressively onto the terrified young woman. "You do not seem to understand the severe gravity of this situation," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, highly intimidating register. "We are not asking for a polite medical appointment. We are currently holding heavily documented digital proof of massive federal wire fraud, severe medical malpractice, and the illegal black market sale of human biological material orchestrated directly by Dr. Vance. If he does not walk out here and speak to us in exactly 60 seconds, I am going to immediately contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the State Medical Ethics Board, and every single major news outlet in the city of Chicago. I will have federal agents tearing this beautiful clinic apart before your lunch break. Now go get him." The receptionist completely panicked. She did not argue or attempt to call the private security guards. She scrambled out from behind the massive marble desk and practically ran down a long white hallway, her high heels clicking frantically against the polished floor. Less than 2 minutes later, a tall, thin man wearing an immaculate white medical coat emerged from the hallway. He looked incredibly pale and highly agitated. It was Dr. Harrison Vance. He recognized me instantly, and a look of pure, absolute terror flashed across his sharp features before he desperately tried to mask it with professional arrogance. "What is the meaning of this massive disruption?" Dr. Vance demanded, his voice shaking slightly as he approached the front desk. "You cannot simply storm into a private medical facility and threaten my staff. I will have you both forcibly removed from the premises immediately." Marcus did not flinch. He slowly opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder containing the heavily encrypted wire transfer logs. He slammed the heavy folder down onto the marble desk, the loud sound echoing sharply. "Cut the pathetic professional act," Harrison Marcus growled. "We know absolutely everything. We know exactly how much Julian paid you to unfreeze Jessica's viable embryos. We have the exact dates, the massive offshore wire transfers, and the digital routing numbers that link completely directly to your private elite wealth management account. You accepted exactly $2.5 million in completely untraceable laundered cash to commit a massive federal crime." Dr. Vance completely froze. The remaining color drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent gray. He looked frantically around the empty lobby, desperately checking to see if anyone else was listening to the massive, catastrophic accusations. "You are completely insane," he hissed, dropping his voice to a panicked whisper. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing any medical procedures." I stepped forward, completely invading his personal space. My eyes were completely dead, and my voice was as sharp as a surgical scalpel. Patient confidentiality absolutely does not cover the illegal black market sale of stolen human genetics, I stated coldly. Julian is completely financially ruined. I have already initiated a legally binding smart contract lien that froze every single operating account at Nova Freight. He does not have the massive resources to protect you anymore, doctor. The federal authorities are already preparing the massive racketeering indictments. When the massive digital evidence goes fully public, you will absolutely lose your highly lucrative medical license. You will lose this beautiful, expensive clinic. And you will spend the absolute rest of your miserable life sitting inside a federal penitentiary cell. Dr. Vance physically staggered backward, leaning heavily against the marble desk for support. He was a wealthy, arrogant man who had genuinely believed he was completely untouchable. But he was absolutely not built for a high-stakes legal war. He was crumbling rapidly under the massive, immense pressure. You have exactly one highly limited opportunity to survive this catastrophic disaster, Marcus continued mercilessly. You are going to walk into your secure private office right now and retrieve the original physical signed contracts where Julian illegally authorized the embryo transfer. You are going to give us the complete, heavily documented medical file, including his forged signature and his fraudulent consent forms. If you cooperate immediately and give us the physical, undeniable evidence we need to completely destroy Julian, we might legally shield you from the absolute worst of the massive federal fallout. If you refuse, we will completely destroy you alongside him. The terrified doctor stared at the thick manila folder lying on the desk. He was frantically weighing his incredibly limited options. He knew Julian had lied, and he knew the massive paper trail was absolutely fatal. He swallowed hard, completely defeated by his own massive greed. "Follow me," he whispered, his voice trembling violently. He turned and walked slowly down the long white hallway, looking like a condemned man walking directly toward the gallows. We followed him into a secure private office and stood completely silently as he unlocked a heavy steel filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick physical file and handed it directly to Marcus. It contained everything: the forged consent signatures, the specific medical protocols, and the undeniable physical proof of Julian's massive, sickening betrayal. We had the absolute final weapon we needed to completely annihilate him. I returned to the quiet sanctuary of my luxury hotel penthouse with Marcus. We carried the heavy physical medical files from Genesis Fertility Institute, like weapons of mass destruction. I placed the thick manila folder onto the glass dining table and immediately opened my encrypted laptop. The trap was fully set, but I needed to know exactly how the cornered rat was reacting to the sudden lack of oxygen. I logged into the hidden administrative backdoor of the Nova Freight corporate network. The massive financial freeze I had initiated earlier that morning had completely paralyzed the entire logistics empire. Automated warning alerts were flashing rapidly across the digital dashboard. Vendor payments were bouncing. Payroll systems were completely locked. The internal corporate messaging system was an absolute war zone of terrified executives and confused department heads. I navigated directly to the secure audiovisual system located inside the primary executive boardroom on the top floor of the downtown corporate headquarters. When I built their internal security network, I discreetly installed hidden microphones and high-definition cameras inside every single executive meeting room. I activated the live feed, and the bright screen instantly displayed the massive mahogany table surrounded by the wealthy, powerful men who controlled the board of directors. The room was absolutely thick with aggressive tension. These were elite venture capitalists and hardened Wall Street veterans who usually sat back and let the money roll in. Now they were sweating through their expensive, tailored suits. The massive initial public offering was scheduled to happen in mere weeks, and suddenly their golden goose was bleeding out on the public stage. The heavy wooden doors of the boardroom swung open and Julian walked in. He had clearly tried to pull himself together after his violent public meltdown in our suburban driveway. He had changed into a fresh dark navy suit and combed his hair, but the sophisticated, charismatic mask was severely cracking. His face was pale and dark purple bags hung heavily beneath his eyes. He walked to the head of the massive table and gripped the edges of the wood so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He did not sit down. He needed to project absolute authority to a room full of men who were moments away from firing him. I turned up the volume on my computer speakers and listened as his deep voice echoed through the hidden microphones. "Gentlemen, I know you are incredibly concerned about the viral social media post and the sudden temporary freeze on our primary operating accounts." He began, his tone perfectly modulated to sound like a calm leader managing an unpredictable crisis. "I need to be completely transparent with all of you today. My wife Jessica is experiencing a severe psychotic break. As you know, she originally helped build some of our early back-end software systems. Unfortunately, she has become violently disgruntled over the past few months. Her mental health has completely deteriorated, and she has spent the morning actively trying to sabotage this massive company and our impending initial public offering out of pure jealous spite." I sat in my quiet hotel room listening to the man I had loved completely assassinate my character with absolute ease. He was a brilliant sociopathic liar. The older board members leaned forward clearly, wanting to believe his smooth, confident narrative. Julian took a deep breath and delivered the massive lie he had undoubtedly spent the entire car ride back to the office practicing. "The social media post involving my secretary is a complete fabrication," he stated, looking directly into the eyes of the lead venture capitalist. "It is a highly manipulated digital image designed specifically to cause a massive public relations scandal. But that is not the real crisis, gentlemen. While you were all distracted by that embarrassing post, she used her outdated administrative access to illegally lock our vendor payment accounts. And she did it to cover her tracks." Julian paused dramatically, letting the heavy silence fill the boardroom. "I have spent the last 2 hours conducting a rapid emergency audit with our internal finance team." He lied smoothly. "We discovered a catastrophic breach. Over the last 6 months, Jessica has systematically embezzled exactly $6 million from our primary research and development budget. She moved the massive funds through a complex series of untraceable offshore shell companies. She stole the money, and she initiated this massive public relations disaster today to completely cover her tracks before we filed the final financial disclosures for the initial public offering." A loud chorus of angry gasps and aggressive shouting erupted around the massive mahogany table. The wealthy board members were absolutely furious. They did not care about a messy corporate affair or a fake pregnancy. But stealing $6 million directly from their pockets was an unforgivable sin. The lead investor slammed his hand down on the table, demanding immediate aggressive action. Julian held up his hands to calm the angry room, playing the role of the reluctant but responsible chief executive officer. "I have already contacted the absolute best corporate defense attorneys in the city," Julian assured them, his voice dripping with fake sorrow. "We are currently drafting a massive federal lawsuit against her. I will be handing all of the fabricated financial evidence over to the federal authorities by tomorrow morning. I will personally ensure she is arrested for massive corporate wire fraud, and I will push the initial public offering forward exactly as scheduled. We just need to weather this temporary storm and trust the legal process." I watched the old wealthy men slowly nod in agreement. They authorized Julian to use whatever aggressive legal force was necessary to completely neutralize the threat. They gave him their absolute blessing to throw his own wife into a federal prison. I reached out and gently closed the laptop screen, cutting off the live video feed from the boardroom. The silence returned to my luxury penthouse, but the air felt entirely different. Julian was backed into a terrifying corner, and he was swinging wildly in the dark. He knew the $6 million was missing, because he was the one who actually stole it, to pay the corrupt fertility clinic and buy his pregnant mistress a luxury penthouse. He knew the federal authorities would eventually notice the massive hole in the corporate ledgers during the mandatory audits for the initial public offering. He was brilliantly attempting to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He planned to completely frame me for his own massive embezzlement and permanently silence me behind federal prison bars, ensuring he could collect his $50 million family trust fund without any interference. He thought he had successfully manipulated the powerful board of directors into acting as his personal legal army. He thought he was currently controlling the entire narrative and setting the perfect trap for my destruction. But he did not realize that I was standing right behind him, holding the exact physical documents that proved every single word out of his mouth was a massive federal crime. Let him call the lawyers. Let him prepare his fake financial evidence. The higher he climbed onto his pedestal of lies, the harder the absolute fall would be. I smiled a cold, calculated smile and picked up my burner phone to call Marcus. It was time to spring the ultimate trap. My burner phone vibrated against the glass dining table almost the exact second I closed my laptop. It was Marcus. I answered the call, and his deep voice immediately filled the quiet room. Julian just formally instructed his massive legal team to draft a federal criminal complaint against you. Marcus stated, his tone urgent and highly focused. They are actively working with the corporate public relations firm to completely control the media narrative. They plan to file the fabricated embezzlement charges with the federal prosecutor early tomorrow morning. He thinks if he strikes first, he can have you physically arrested and locked in a holding cell before the initial public offering bell rings. He genuinely believes he has a 24-hour head start. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the dark, choppy waters of Lake Michigan. He does not have a 24-hour head start, I replied, my voice completely steady. I just watched the entire emergency board meeting through the hidden audio-visual system I installed in the executive boardroom 4 years ago. I heard every single desperate lie he told the venture capitalists. He is backed into a corner, and he is trying to use the federal authorities as his own personal attack dogs. But we are not going to sit here and wait for his expensive lawyers to file their fabricated paperwork. We are going direct to the absolute top of the federal food chain right now. Marcus let out a low, appreciative laugh. You are terrifyingly brilliant, Jessica, he said. I have my personal legal team standing by. We need to hit him with a massive coordinated legal strike that completely paralyzes his offensive strategy. If we file our verified evidence first, his fabricated lawsuit will instantly look like a desperate retaliatory cover-up. We are going to bury him under so many federal subpoenas he will not be able to breathe. We spent the next 4 hours turning my luxury hotel penthouse into a highly classified legal war room. I opened my encrypted hard drives and extracted every single piece of digital evidence we had carefully gathered. I printed out the shadow ledgers, the offshore wire transfer receipts, and the highly detailed metadata logs proving Julian had authorized the theft from his own research and development budget. Marcus sat across from me at the glass table, rapidly drafting the most devastating legal documents of his entire career. He was not just acting as my personal attorney. He was acting as a senior corporate whistleblower, legally protecting himself from the massive radioactive fallout of his brother's catastrophic crimes. The first document we finalized was the formal petition for absolute divorce. It was not a standard amicable separation agreement. It was a ruthless, aggressive legal strike designed to immediately freeze all of his remaining personal assets. I demanded complete sole custody of my biological child currently gestating inside his mistress's womb. I demanded total ownership of the massive suburban estate and a permanent injunction against him, liquidating any marital property. But the divorce papers were simply the absolute bare minimum. They were just a minor inconvenience compared to the massive legal bombs we were preparing to drop on his professional empire. The second lawsuit was a massive civil action for severe medical malpractice, biological theft, and extreme emotional distress. We explicitly named Dr. Harrison Vance, the Genesis Fertility Institute, and Julian as co-conspirators in a highly coordinated black market medical operation. We attached high-resolution color copies of the original signed consent forms Dr. Vance had surrendered to us earlier that afternoon. The undeniable physical proof of Julian's forged signature was front and center. This specific lawsuit would immediately trigger a massive state medical board investigation, automatically suspending the doctor's medical license and freezing the clinic's operations. But the absolute final document was the fatal blow. It was a highly detailed, comprehensive whistleblower report addressed directly to the Division of Enforcement at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Nova Freight was mere weeks away from a massive billion-dollar initial public offering. The federal government takes corporate fraud incredibly seriously when massive public investor money is on the line. Julian had deliberately embezzled $6 million from a heavily promoted research and development budget and systematically lied about the company's financial health to top-tier venture capitalists. This was not a simple family dispute. This was textbook corporate racketeering and massive wire fraud. By late afternoon, we had compiled a massive physical dossier. It was 3 inches thick, packed with undeniable financial ledgers, signed medical confessions, and legally binding trust fund documents outlining his sick biological motive. We did not trust this massive package to a standard courier or a simple digital email. Marcus made a highly classified phone call to a senior federal prosecutor he had worked with in the past. We secured an emergency closed-door meeting at the federal courthouse located in the heart of the downtown financial district. We walked through the heavy metal detectors and rode the secure elevator to the upper floors of the federal building. We were escorted into a stark windowless conference room where 3 senior agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission and a high-ranking federal prosecutor were already waiting. They looked highly skeptical when we first walked in. Wealthy corporate executives routinely throw wild accusations at each other during hostile takeovers and bitter divorces. But their skepticism completely vanished the absolute second Marcus placed the massive physical dossier onto the metal table and slid it across to the lead prosecutor. "I am the chief legal counsel for Nova Freight Logistics." Marcus stated, his voice radiating absolute professional authority. "And this is Jessica, the senior data architect who built the corporate financial infrastructure. We are officially invoking federal whistleblower protection. The chief executive officer, Julian, has successfully embezzled millions of dollars from the primary research budget to fund a massive illegal medical procedure and purchase luxury real estate. He is currently actively defrauding major venture capital firms and attempting to push through a fraudulent initial public offering. We have brought you the raw digital ledgers, the offshore bank routing numbers, and the physical signed confessions from his medical conspirators." The lead federal prosecutor opened the thick folder. The room went completely dead silent as the highly trained agents began rapidly scanning the pristine financial evidence and the shocking medical contracts. They did not need to spend weeks conducting a massive complex investigation. I had already done absolutely all of the highly technical forensic accounting for them. I had connected every single dot, laid out the exact timeline, and provided the precise legal motive tied directly to his $50 million hidden family trust fund. The evidence was absolutely bulletproof and legally undeniable. The lead prosecutor looked up from the thick documents, his eyes wide with genuine shock and absolute predatory focus. The federal government loves nothing more than taking down a massive, arrogant corporate thief right before he rings the stock exchange bell. He looked directly at Marcus and then at me. "If these digital ledgers are fully verified, we will have enough probable cause to issue massive federal arrest warrants by tomorrow evening." The prosecutor stated, his voice completely serious. "We will immediately freeze the entire initial public offering and seize every single corporate asset connected to his name." I looked back at the powerful federal agent, feeling a deep, absolute sense of cold satisfaction. Julian thought he could use his expensive lawyers to quietly file fabricated charges and have me thrown in a holding cell. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of legal chess. But while he was desperately trying to plan his opening move, I had just completely flipped the entire massive board upside down. I had handed the federal government the exact weapons they needed to completely obliterate his entire existence. The legal trap was completely set, and the massive steel jaws were finally ready to snap shut. Now I just needed to make sure Julian walked directly onto the biggest public stage possible before the absolute destruction rained down on him. The massive legal machinery of the federal government was finally in motion, but I knew Julian was far too arrogant to simply sit still and wait for the devastating blow. He was completely trapped in a massive financial gridlock, desperately trying to maintain the fragile illusion of control, while his logistics empire actively crumbled around him. While Marcus coordinated the final complex details with the senior federal prosecutors, I returned to my secure digital command center in the luxury penthouse. I needed to monitor the internal communications of Nova Freight to ensure Julian did not attempt to execute a sudden, desperate extraction of his remaining liquid assets. I opened my encrypted laptop and logged directly back into the hidden administrative backdoor of the corporate network. The internal digital chatter was completely chaotic. Executives were sending panicked emails regarding the massive frozen vendor accounts. Human resources managers were frantically trying to calm terrified employees who were suddenly unable to access their standard direct deposit payroll. Julian was completely silent on the official corporate channels. He was likely hiding inside his massive corner office, desperately consulting with his expensive crisis management team. But I was not just monitoring Julian's communications. I was highly focused on the massive weak link in his entire criminal operation. I was focused entirely on Madison. When I successfully hacked the corporate social media accounts earlier that morning to post the undeniable ultrasound image, I did not just temporarily commandeer Madison's administrative login credentials. I exploited a massive vulnerability in her personal device. Because her mobile phone was directly connected to the secure Nova Freight corporate wireless network, I used my hidden administrative access to secretly install a highly sophisticated passive surveillance script directly onto her device. It was a digital ghost that silently recorded every single keystroke text message and audio call she made, routing the raw data entirely back to my secure server. I opened the specific surveillance portal on my laptop and began filtering through the massive incoming data streams. Madison was absolutely panicking. The confident, arrogant mistress who had cruelly mocked me over the phone just a few hours ago was now completely terrified. She was rapidly searching the internet for articles regarding federal corporate embezzlement and the massive legal penalties for severe medical fraud. She was frantically texting her equally shallow friends, complaining that Julian had suddenly stopped answering her calls and that his massive credit cards were completely declining when she tried to purchase expensive designer clothes. She could feel the massive ship rapidly sinking beneath her feet, and her primary instinct was not loyalty. It was absolute pure self-preservation. Suddenly, the digital audio monitor on my screen flashed a bright warning red. Madison had just initiated a direct outbound phone call to Julian's secure private mobile number. I immediately clicked the audio icon, and the live recording began streaming directly through my heavy computer speakers. The line rang 3 times before Julian finally answered. His voice sounded incredibly ragged and deeply exhausted. "What do you want, Madison?" He snapped, his tone completely devoid of the charming affection he usually used to easily manipulate her. "I am currently dealing with a massive, catastrophic corporate crisis right now. I explicitly told you to stay hidden inside the luxury penthouse and absolutely not to contact me on my primary device." Madison's voice trembled slightly, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp, highly defensive arrogance. "Do not speak to me like I am just one of your disposable employees, Julian," she shot back, her tone rising in volume. "I saw the massive viral post on the corporate social media page. I saw the horrifying comments from the senior board of directors. The entire massive logistics industry thinks I am carrying your illegal baby, and now the primary corporate operating accounts are completely frozen. My platinum credit card just declined at a luxury department store. You told me we were completely untouchable. You told me the massive $50 million trust fund was absolutely guaranteed." "It is guaranteed," Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, panicked whisper. "Jessica is having a severe mental breakdown. She illegally hacked the corporate systems to create a massive public relations disaster. My elite legal team is already aggressively handling the situation. We are filing massive federal criminal charges against her tomorrow morning. I just need you to remain completely silent and out of the public eye until the initial public offering is finalized and the massive trust fund legally unlocks. I will transfer money to a private account for your immediate expenses tonight. Just stay absolutely quiet." I listened intently to the live audio feed, a cold, highly calculated smile forming on my face. Julian was desperately trying to keep his fragile house of cards from completely collapsing. But Madison was entirely driven by pure superficial greed. She did not care about his massive logistics empire or his complex legal strategies. She cared exclusively about her own massive financial payout. "I am not just going to sit quietly in this penthouse while you completely lose control of your massive company," Julian Madison demanded, her voice suddenly sharp and incredibly calculating. "I know exactly what is going on. I know you did not just magically arrange a standard medical procedure. I heard you screaming on the phone with Dr. Vance last week. I know you violently stole her biological embryos because you are completely sterile, and you desperately needed a fake heir to secure that massive inheritance. If your wealthy board of directors or the federal authorities find out the actual medical truth about this pregnancy, you are going to go to federal prison for a very long time." The line went completely dead silent for 3 long, terrifying seconds. Julian was absolutely trapped. His young, naive mistress was actively blackmailing him with the exact massive criminal secret he was desperately trying to hide from the federal government. "Are you seriously trying to extort me right now, Madison?" he finally asked, his voice vibrating with absolute, pure, unfiltered rage. "I am simply aggressively securing my own financial future," she replied, her tone dripping with toxic confidence. "I am the one carrying the massive physical evidence of your massive federal crimes. If you want me to remain completely silent and play the role of the tragic innocent victim, when the media inevitably finds out about the clinic, you need to pay me exactly $5 million in completely untraceable offshore cash by tomorrow afternoon. If the massive money is not in my private account, I will personally walk directly into the federal prosecutor's office and tell them absolutely everything. I will hand them my medical files and tell them you aggressively forced me into the illegal procedure." Julian let out a sickening, ragged breath, completely cornered by his own massive, horrific actions. "I will get you the money," he whispered, his voice completely defeated. "Just keep your mouth absolutely shut until tomorrow." He hung up the phone. I reached out and gently saved the pristine, high-definition digital audio file directly to my highly secure encrypted hard drive. Madison thought she had just brilliantly secured a massive financial windfall. Julian thought he had just temporarily bought her complete silence. They were both absolutely, incredibly stupid. Madison had just legally provided me with a flawless, undeniable recorded confession, proving they both knew exactly what massive crimes they had committed. I immediately drafted a secure encrypted email and sent the massive audio file directly to Marcus and the senior federal prosecutors. The massive trap was no longer just set. The heavy steel doors had completely slammed shut, locking them both inside. The annual Nova Freight Investor Gala was exactly 24 hours away. It was the absolute crown jewel of the corporate social calendar. Every single year, Julian rented out the massive grand ballroom at the most exclusive luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical performance designed to dazzle the Wall Street elite and project an image of absolute, unstoppable corporate dominance. This year, the stakes were astronomically high. The gala was serving as the final massive promotional push before the billion-dollar initial public offering launched the following week. Julian needed the night to be completely flawless. He needed the wealthy venture capitalist to drink expensive champagne, look at his confident smile, and completely forget about the viral social media scandal and the massive frozen operating accounts. Julian genuinely thought he had successfully neutralized me. After he pitched his fabricated embezzlement story to the board of directors, he immediately instructed his corporate security team to permanently revoke my building access credentials and explicitly ban my name from the official gala guest list. He hired additional private security guards to stand at the ballroom doors, with strict orders to physically remove me if I dared to show my face. He thought I was currently sitting alone in a cheap motel room, trembling in absolute fear, while his expensive lawyers drafted massive federal criminal charges against me. He thought he had successfully built an impenetrable fortress around his precious public image. But a fortress is completely useless if the enemy is already standing directly inside the heavily fortified walls. Marcus and I did not spend the evening hiding. We spent the evening actively turning Julian's most powerful allies into his absolute worst enemies. The federal prosecutors we had met with earlier that afternoon were highly motivated, but federal bureaucracy moves at a very specific, calculated pace. They needed 48 hours to officially unseal the massive indictments and coordinate a high-profile raid. But I did not want Julian arrested quietly in his office on a random Tuesday morning. I wanted him completely ruined on the exact stage he had built to celebrate his massive false victory. The lead federal prosecutor agreed to a highly unconventional tactical arrangement. They would execute the massive arrest warrants live at the Investor Gala the following evening, but only if Marcus and I could successfully guarantee the absolute cooperation of the senior corporate board members. The federal agents did not want a massive chaotic riot involving confused billionaires. They wanted a perfectly controlled public execution. Securing the cooperation of the board of directors was not a difficult task. Wealthy venture capitalists do not possess any genuine loyalty. Their only true allegiance is to their massive financial portfolios. Marcus utilized his extreme executive authority as chief legal counsel to arrange a highly classified off-the-books meeting later that evening. We did not meet in a shiny corporate boardroom. We met in the dark, secure private dining room of an elite steakhouse heavily favored by the Chicago financial elite. The four most powerful investors on the Nova Freight board arrived looking highly irritated and deeply suspicious. They still believed Julian's smooth, confident lies about my supposed mental breakdown and my fabricated corporate embezzlement. They sat around the heavy circular table, their arms crossed defensively. I did not waste my breath trying to appeal to their human emotions or their basic sense of morality. Men who control billions of dollars do not care about broken marriages or stolen biological embryos. I opened my encrypted laptop and projected the raw shadow ledgers directly onto the large television screen mounted on the dark wood-paneled wall. I walked them step by painstaking step through the exact digital sequence of the massive theft. I showed them exactly how Julian had systematically drained $6 million from their highly guarded research and development budget. I showed them the offshore shell companies, the laundered wire transfers, and the undeniable final destination of the stolen corporate funds. I presented the signed medical confessions and the massive trust fund documents, proving his exact sick financial motive. I watched the absolute arrogance drain completely out of their wealthy faces. Their deep irritation instantly transformed into a cold, violent fury. They realized they had been played for absolute fools. Julian had looked them directly in the eyes and lied to them while actively stealing their money to buy a luxury penthouse for his young mistress. The lead investor, an incredibly ruthless Wall Street veteran whose approval was absolutely critical for the initial public offering, slammed his heavy crystal glass down onto the table. He did not yell. His voice was a deadly quiet whisper. He asked Marcus what the exact legal strategy was moving forward. Marcus leaned forward and outlined the final devastating trap. He explained that the federal prosecutors had already verified the massive digital evidence and were currently preparing the federal arrest warrants for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and medical racketeering. He told the investors that if they attempted to warn Julian or cover up the massive crimes, the federal government would immediately freeze their massive venture capital funds and indict them as active co-conspirators. But if they simply attended the gala, smiled at Julian, and allowed the federal agents to execute the highly public arrest, they could legally distance themselves from the catastrophic fallout and easily install Marcus as the new chief executive officer to save the massive company. The choice was incredibly simple. They instantly agreed to throw Julian directly to the federal wolves. They agreed to attend the massive luxury gala and play their respective parts perfectly. They would shake his hand, drink his expensive champagne, and watch him completely burn. I returned to my luxury hotel penthouse late that night, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute calm. The massive complex trap was completely set. Every single piece was perfectly locked into its exact proper position. Julian was going to wake up the next morning completely oblivious to the massive, terrifying reality that his entire empire was already dead. He was going to put on a custom-tailored tuxedo and walk directly into a grand ballroom completely filled with federal agents pretending to be waiters and wealthy investors who had already signed his absolute death warrant. He thought he was the master puppeteer pulling the strings on my entire life. But tomorrow night he would finally realize that he was just a pathetic little puppet dancing directly toward his own absolute destruction. And I was going to be standing right there in the front row, watching the massive curtain permanently fall. The grand ballroom of the Chicago luxury hotel was a dazzling spectacle of extreme wealth and carefully manufactured corporate illusion. Thousands of imported white orchids spilled over the edges of towering crystal centerpieces, catching the warm light of the massive chandeliers hanging from the gilded ceiling. Waiters in crisp white uniforms moved seamlessly through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with top-tier champagne and caviar. The room was absolutely packed with the most powerful venture capitalists, Wall Street bankers, and logistics industry titans in the entire country. They were all wearing bespoke tuxedos and expensive designer gowns, holding their crystal glasses and buzzing with intense anticipation. To the untrained eye, this was the ultimate celebration of an unstoppable corporate juggernaut mere days away from a historic billion-dollar initial public offering. But I knew the absolute truth. I knew the massive operating accounts of Nova Freight were completely frozen. I knew the research and development budget had been violently gutted. And I knew that several of the men drinking the expensive champagne were actively waiting for the federal government to raid the entire building. Suddenly, the ambient string quartet music faded away, and the massive LED screens flanking the main stage flashed with the sleek modern Nova Freight corporate logo. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and Julian walked out into the blinding white spotlight. He looked absolutely flawless. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His dark hair was meticulously styled, and his teeth practically gleamed under the stage lights as he flashed his signature charismatic smile. He walked to the clear acrylic podium with the smooth, confident stride of a man who owned the entire world. He did not look like a desperate corporate criminal who was actively being blackmailed by his pregnant 24-year-old mistress. He did not look like a man whose personal checking accounts were currently overdrawn. He looked like a visionary king stepping up to claim his ultimate crown. The massive crowd erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. Julian raised his hands in a humble, highly practiced gesture, absorbing the massive adoration and letting the heavy applause wash over him for several long seconds before leaning closely into the microphone. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." Julian began, his deep baritone voice echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you all for joining me tonight to celebrate the incredible future of Nova Freight Logistics. Before we discuss the massive technological innovations and the impending initial public offering, I want to take a brief moment to directly address the unfortunate situation that occurred on our corporate social media channels yesterday morning." A heavy, hushed silence immediately fell over the massive ballroom. Every single wealthy investor leaned forward, completely hooked by the dramatic tension. Julian looked down at his hands, projecting a sickeningly perfect image of a heartbroken but resilient leader. As many of you know, building a massive corporate empire requires intense sacrifice. He continued, his voice softening into a tone of deep, fake sorrow. And sometimes the people we love the most are simply unable to handle the immense pressure. My wife Jessica has unfortunately been suffering from a severe and rapidly deteriorating mental health crisis. Yesterday, she experienced a complete psychotic break. In a tragic state of paranoid delusion, she utilized her outdated administrative access to hack into our public relations network and broadcast a highly manipulated, fabricated image. Julian paused, letting a perfectly timed heavy sigh amplify his massive lie. He looked up, scanning the crowd with false sincerity. She posted a fake medical document attempting to humiliate my dedicated executive staff and actively sabotage the massive future we have all built together. It was a desperate cry for help from a deeply unwell woman who has sadly allowed bitter jealousy to completely consume her rational mind. I have already engaged top-tier psychiatric professionals to ensure she receives the intensive medical care she so desperately needs right now. I have also instructed our elite cybersecurity team to completely overhaul our entire digital infrastructure, ensuring our public platforms are entirely secure moving forward. I ask for your privacy and your prayers for her during this incredibly difficult domestic tragedy. But I also want to assure every single investor in this room that the core foundation of Nova Freight remains absolutely bulletproof. We will not let the tragic actions of one mentally unstable individual derail our historic momentum. We are moving forward with the initial public offering exactly as planned. The crowd actually murmured in deep, sympathetic agreement. Several older executives nodded their heads completely, buying the pathetic narrative of the brilliant chief executive burdened by a hysterical, vindictive wife. Julian smiled a brave, sad smile and smoothly pivoted the massive presentation toward his fraudulent financial projections. He gestured confidently to the massive glowing screens, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality surrounding him. I was not watching him from a secure digital feed inside my luxury hotel penthouse anymore. I was standing perfectly still in the dark, heavy shadows of the VIP staging area, located directly behind the massive velvet curtains. I was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald green designer gown that cost more than his mistress's entire wardrobe. My hair was perfectly styled, and my makeup was absolutely flawless. I held a small, sleek microphone in my right hand. Standing right next to me in the absolute dark was Marcus, his massive arms crossed tightly over his chest, and a cold, predatory smile fixed on his face. We listened to Julian seamlessly execute his massive public lie, spinning his federal crimes into a tragic domestic sob story. He genuinely believed he had successfully controlled the entire narrative. He felt the absolute triumph of a man who had completely outsmarted everyone in the room. He felt incredibly powerful. He felt completely untouchable. But he was just an arrogant rat standing precisely on the center trigger of a massive steel trap. And it was finally time for me to step out of the shadows and let the heavy blade drop. I did not step out from behind the heavy velvet curtain just yet. The grand finale of a meticulously orchestrated corporate demolition requires absolute perfect timing and infinite patience. Marcus placed his large hand gently on my shoulder and silently pointed to the high-definition technical monitor sitting on a black equipment crate in the dark staging area. The glowing screen displayed multiple live camera angles from the main ballroom floor, capturing every single movement in the massive room. While Julian was standing under the bright lights of the main stage, actively soaking up the massive unearned applause, my eyes were completely fixed on camera feed number 4. The camera was angled perfectly toward the exclusive VIP tables located right at the edge of the plush red carpet. And sitting right there, basking in the reflected glory of a stolen logistics empire, was Madison. She had completely disregarded Julian's frantic, desperate orders to remain quietly hidden inside her luxury penthouse. Her massive greed and her desperate, pathetic need for high society validation had completely overpowered her basic common sense. She could not resist the overwhelming urge to publicly flaunt her fake victory in front of the wealthiest people in the entire city of Chicago. She was wearing a blindingly expensive silver designer maternity gown that clung tightly to her body. The dress was specifically tailored to aggressively accentuate the slight swell of her stolen pregnancy, ensuring every single person in the room knew exactly who she was and what she was carrying. She was parading around the edge of the ballroom floor, actively seeking the attention of the corporate elite, completely oblivious to the massive invisible crosshairs painted directly on her back. But it was not the ridiculous silver dress or the expensive professional makeup that caught my immediate analytical attention. It was the massive, flawless diamond glittering aggressively on her left ring finger. It was easily a 5-carat stone radiating absolute luxury under the massive crystal chandeliers. Julian must have frantically purchased that exact ring earlier this afternoon, using the absolute last hidden drops of his stolen corporate liquidity, just to keep her temporarily quiet after her aggressive blackmail threat. She was happily flaunting a massive diamond, bought entirely with embezzled federal funds. She truly believed the massive stone was a genuine symbol of Julian's undying love and her newly secured status as the untouchable queen of the logistics industry. She was completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that the diamond was essentially a tracking beacon for the federal agents currently circling the room. I watched through the glowing digital monitor as the lead venture capitalist walked directly up to Madison's table. This was the exact same ruthless Wall Street veteran who had sat in the dark private steakhouse with Marcus and me just a few hours ago. He had personally viewed the undeniable digital shadow ledgers and the signed medical confessions outlining their massive federal crimes. Now he was playing his assigned undercover role with absolutely flawless precision. He offered Madison a warm, charming smile and handed her a crystal glass of expensive sparkling apple cider. Madison eagerly accepted the non-alcoholic drink, completely falling for his highly calculated corporate charm. She immediately placed her free hand protectively over her stomach, projecting the sickening manufactured image of a glowing, expectant mother. I reached out and turned up the audio feed on the technical monitor. Her high-pitched, arrogant voice filtered clearly through the small black speakers, completely cutting through the ambient noise of the crowded ballroom. "It has just been such an incredibly stressful week," she sighed dramatically, leaning closer to the wealthy investor to ensure he heard every single pathetic word. "Julian is working so incredibly hard to protect this massive company and our new family, but his ex-wife has made things absolutely terrifying for us. She is completely delusional and incredibly dangerous. The lead investor nodded sympathetically, adopting a look of deep fake concern, and silently urging her to continue digging her own massive legal grave. It is honestly just a tragic, pathetic situation. Madison continued taking a small, delicate sip of her cider and aggressively flashing her massive stolen diamond under the bright lights. Jessica was completely barren, you know. Her physical body was just entirely broken, and she simply could not give Julian the healthy, strong family he so desperately deserved. It completely drove her crazy over the years. When Julian and I finally found out about our beautiful little miracle, she just completely snapped. She illegally hacked the corporate page because she is insanely jealous of my youth and my healthy natural pregnancy. She is just a bitter, washed-up failure trying to aggressively destroy the beautiful life Julian and I are building together. I listened to the naive young secretary confidently repeat the cruel, sickening lies Julian had aggressively fed her. She was actively bragging about carrying a stolen biological child directly to the exact man who was currently helping coordinate her massive federal arrest. She genuinely felt completely superior to the intelligent woman she thought she had successfully manipulated and replaced. She stood on the expensive red carpet, completely surrounded by undercover Federal Bureau of Investigation agents who were quietly masquerading as catering staff and security personnel. She had absolutely no idea that every single arrogant word leaving her mouth was being mentally recorded by the very people preparing to lock her inside a maximum security federal prison. Madison took another long sip of her drink and laughed a high, irritating sound that barely masked her deep underlying insecurity. She looked around the massive ballroom, clearly expecting the wealthy investors to bow down to her new royal status. She wanted them to look at her youth and her massive diamond and validate the terrible crimes she had helped commit. Her massive, unfiltered hubris was physically sickening to witness, but it only made the impending absolute destruction that much more deeply satisfying. I looked away from the digital monitor and gave Marcus a single slow nod. The final stage was completely set, and the villains were perfectly positioned exactly where we needed them. It was time to show them both exactly who truly owned the massive empire they thought they had stolen. Julian finished his tragic opening monologue and turned his attention back to the massive audience. Now let us turn our eyes toward the massive financial future of this incredible logistics company, he announced, his voice booming with renewed artificial energy. If you will direct your attention to the screens behind me, I will walk you through the staggering revenue projections for our upcoming initial public offering. He reached into the pocket of his tailored tuxedo and pulled out a small wireless remote. He pressed the button, expecting to see a highly polished graph projecting billions of dollars in future profits. Instead, the massive screens went completely black. The heavy theatrical lighting in the ballroom suddenly dimmed, plunging the wealthy crowd into a state of confused twilight. Julian pressed the button on his remote a second time, and then a third, his polished smile faltering slightly as he tapped the plastic casing against the palm of his hand. I stepped up to the technical console hidden in the dark staging area and pressed the execute key on my encrypted laptop. The massive screens flanking the main stage did not display his carefully crafted financial presentation. They flashed a blinding, bright white light before instantly mirroring the exact digital feed from my computer desktop. The sudden visual change caused a wave of confused murmurs to ripple through the massive crowd. Julian turned around to look at the screens, his brow furrowing in deep irritation, as he realized his flawless presentation had been completely hijacked. He desperately signaled his security team, but they were already completely neutralized by the undercover agents. I did not wait for him to figure out what was happening. I handed my laptop to the lead federal agent standing in the shadows, and I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtain. I walked directly toward the top of the grand sweeping marble staircase that descended onto the main ballroom floor. Marcus stepped out right beside me, offering his strong arm for support. We began our slow, highly deliberate descent. The bright spotlight operators, completely confused by the sudden change in programming, instinctively swung the massive beams of light directly onto us. I was wearing a floor-length emerald green gown that caught the bright light beautifully. My hair was perfectly styled, and my head was held high. My posture was completely rigid. I looked absolutely nothing like the broken, hysterical, mentally unstable woman Julian had just aggressively described to the entire room. I looked like a fierce woman stepping forward to reclaim her stolen throne. The massive ballroom went completely dead silent. The wealthy venture capitalists, the Wall Street bankers, and the elite media members completely stopped talking. Julian stared up at the staircase, his eyes widening in absolute horrific shock. The color completely drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified ghost. He dropped his wireless remote onto the hard stage floor, the plastic shattering into tiny pieces. "Jessica," he whispered into his live microphone, his voice echoing loudly with pure, unadulterated panic. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase and gracefully accepted a sleek silver microphone from one of the undercover federal agents disguised as an audio technician. I did not scream or yell. I simply looked directly at Julian, who was physically trembling on the main stage, and then I looked over at Madison, who was frozen in pure terror at her luxury table. "Turn on the primary audio file." I instructed, my voice completely calm and deadly cold, echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art speaker system. The massive ballroom filled with a sudden sharp static before the crystal-clear digital recording began to play. It was the exact audio file I had intercepted earlier that afternoon. Madison's high-pitched, arrogant voice bounced off the gilded ceiling. "If you want me to remain completely silent and play the role of the tragic innocent victim when the media inevitably finds out about the clinic, you need to pay me exactly $5 million. I heard you screaming on the phone with Dr. Vance last week. I know you violently stole her biological embryos because you are completely sterile and you desperately needed a fake heir to secure that massive inheritance." The recorded audio of Julian frantically begging her to stay quiet followed immediately completely, verifying her devastating blackmail demands. The massive crowd gasped in absolute unified horror. The wealthy investors who had just authorized his massive legal defense funds stared at the stage in pure disgust. Madison dropped her crystal glass of sparkling cider onto the red carpet, the glass shattering completely as she desperately tried to cover her face with her trembling hands. The audio recording stopped, leaving a suffocating heavy silence in its wake. I raised the microphone to my lips. "My husband just stood on this very stage and told you I suffered a severe psychotic break. I announced, my voice radiating absolute authority and cold, lethal precision. He told you I fabricated a medical scandal out of pure, bitter jealousy. But Julian is completely sterile. He has been medically sterile for our entire marriage." I raised my free hand and signaled the technical console. The massive screens behind Julian instantly changed, displaying high-resolution color copies of the heavily redacted medical files from Genesis Fertility Institute. The crowd stared at the undeniable physical proof of the forged signatures, the black market financial transfers, and the specific genetic lot numbers. 5 years ago, Julian and I created 5 perfect biological embryos, using an anonymous donor and my own eggs. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the main stage. He told me they were destroyed in a catastrophic equipment failure. But he secretly paid exactly $2.5 million in completely untraceable stolen corporate funds to bribe a corrupt medical doctor. He paid that doctor to unfreeze my stolen biological property and medically implant it into the young, naive womb of his 24-year-old secretary. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaotic shouting. The sheer magnitude of the biological violation completely shattered the polite corporate decorum. I raised my hand, calling for total silence, and the room immediately obeyed, completely captivated by the horrifying truth. You might ask yourselves why a highly successful chief executive officer would commit such a massive, sickening federal crime. I said, my voice slicing through the remaining murmurs like a sharp blade. Why would he risk his entire logistics empire and his impending initial public offering just to orchestrate a fake pregnancy? The answer is completely tied to his own massive, blinding greed. I signaled the technical console one final time. The massive screens shifted to display the highly classified legal documents from his late grandfather's estate, highlighting the specific $50 million trust fund clause in bright yellow text. "Julian turns 35 years old next month," I explained, staring directly into his completely broken, terrified eyes. "If he does not produce a living biological heir by that exact date, he permanently loses a $50 million family trust fund. He did not steal my biological child because he wanted to be a loving father. He used his mistress as a disposable human incubator to completely secure a massive hidden fortune, planning to brutally discard both of us. The absolute second the massive money transferred into his private accounts. Julian was physically backing away from the clear acrylic podium, his chest heaving violently as he desperately struggled to breathe. He looked frantically out into the massive audience seeking any sign of support, but he found absolutely nothing. The senior board members were staring at him with pure aggressive hatred. The powerful Wall Street bankers were already pulling out their phones to rapidly cancel their massive investment orders. He was entirely alone. Madison was sobbing hysterically at her table, surrounded by the angry, glaring faces of the corporate elite she had so desperately tried to impress just 10 minutes earlier. She finally realized that her massive shiny diamond was completely worthless, and that she was actively carrying the exact physical evidence that would send her directly to a federal prison. I stood perfectly still on the plush red carpet, radiating the absolute untouchable power of a woman who had just successfully executed the most flawless corporate demolition in history. Julian, you thought you could completely bury me in your digital shadows. I said my final words, echoing like a heavy judge delivering a permanent death sentence. But you completely forgot that I am the master architect of your entire world. The baby she is carrying is legally and biologically mine. And this massive company you thought you completely owned is officially entirely finished. The echo of my final words had barely faded into the gilded ceiling when the heavy double doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung violently open. They did not open for late-arriving guests or additional catering staff. A highly coordinated team of 20 federal agents, wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed in bold yellow across their chests, marched directly into the room. Their movements were precise, aggressive, and entirely uncompromising. The undercover agents, who had been masquerading as waiters and security personnel, instantly broke their cover, stepping forward to aggressively secure the perimeter of the massive room. The wealthy investors parted like the Red Sea, completely terrified by the sudden massive display of absolute federal power. I handed my microphone back to the undercover audio technician and stood perfectly still next to Marcus, watching the beautiful destruction unfold. The lead federal prosecutor, the exact same intense man we had met with in the secure courthouse earlier that afternoon, walked directly down the center aisle. He did not look at the panicking crowd. His sharp eyes were locked entirely on Julian, who was still standing completely frozen on the main stage. Julian looked like a broken mechanical toy that had suddenly run entirely out of power. He could not speak. He could not run. He could only stand there and watch as two heavily armed agents climbed the short set of stairs and completely flanked his sides. Julian Vance, the lead prosecutor, announced his deep voice, projecting naturally across the dead silent room without the need for a microphone. You are under absolute federal arrest. You are being officially charged with massive corporate wire fraud, international money laundering, criminal embezzlement, and severe medical racketeering. Turn around and place your hands firmly behind your back. Julian slowly shook his head from side to side, his perfectly styled hair falling wildly across his sweaty, pale forehead. He looked down at me standing on the plush red carpet, his eyes silently begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I did not blink. I simply stared right through his pathetic facade. The federal agents did not wait for his voluntary compliance. They violently grabbed his expensive tailored shoulders, spun him around, and slammed his wrists tightly together. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely into place echoed loudly through the completely silent ballroom. It was the absolute final nail in the massive coffin of his corporate empire. Suddenly, a loud, piercing scream completely shattered the heavy silence. It was Madison. Two female federal agents had rapidly approached her luxury table. They did not treat her like a fragile pregnant victim. They treated her like a highly active co-conspirator in a massive multi-million-dollar federal crime. Madison violently thrashed against their firm grip, her heavy silver designer maternity gown twisting awkwardly around her legs. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this," she shrieked, her voice completely hysterical and grating. "He forced me to do it. He told me we were getting $50 million. I am entirely innocent." The lead prosecutor turned his head and looked directly at her. We have the crystal clear digital audio recording of you actively extorting him for $5 million in stolen corporate funds, he stated coldly. You are completely complicit, and you are absolutely going to federal prison right alongside him. Madison collapsed onto the red carpet, sobbing violently, as the cold steel cuffs were forcefully locked around her own wrists. Her massive stolen diamonds scraped uselessly against the hard floor. The lead venture capitalist, the powerful man who controlled the absolute financial lifeline of the entire logistics company, stepped forward from the stunned crowd. He looked directly up at Julian, who was currently being physically dragged off the stage by the federal agents. On behalf of the entire corporate board of directors and the primary underwriting syndicate, we are officially completely withdrawing all financial support for Nova Freight Logistics. The wealthy investor declared, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disgust. The impending initial public offering is completely canceled, effective immediately. You are permanently terminated as Chief Executive Officer. We will aggressively cooperate with the federal government to completely liquidate your remaining personal assets to recover our stolen funds. Julian completely stopped struggling against the agents. His entire body went completely limp. In less than 5 short minutes, he had lost absolutely everything in the world. He lost his massive logistics company. He lost his impending billion-dollar public offering. He lost his fake biological heir and his hidden $50 million family trust fund. He was no longer a visionary corporate king. He was just a pathetic, broken criminal being forcefully marched out of his own lavish party in front of the entire logistics industry. I watched him disappear through the heavy wooden doors flanked by the federal agents. The massive ballroom was completely paralyzed in shock, but I felt absolutely nothing but pure, deep-breathing relief. The massive surgical strike was completely successful, and I was finally entirely free. 8 months have passed since the unforgettable night. The massive logistics empire came crashing down under the blinding lights of the grand ballroom. I am currently sitting in the warm morning sunlight of my sprawling suburban estate, looking down at the beautiful, perfectly healthy newborn baby boy resting peacefully in my arms. He has my dark hair and my bright eyes. After a highly aggressive and incredibly brief legal battle, the family court judge awarded me absolute sole custody of my biological child. But the absolute sweetest victory was the final ruling from the state probate court, because the massive $50 million family trust fund was legally bound to the birth of this specific child, and because Julian was currently sitting inside a federal prison completely stripped of all his parental rights, the massive fortune bypassed him entirely. The massive $50 million trust fund legally transferred directly into my absolute personal control to completely secure the bright future of my beautiful son. Julian received absolutely nothing but a heavy 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His expensive tailored suits and luxury sports cars had been permanently replaced by a standard orange jumpsuit and a cold concrete cell. Madison did not get the massive luxury penthouse or the lavish billionaire lifestyle she so aggressively demanded. After giving birth and relinquishing the child that was never genetically hers, she was completely bankrupted by the massive legal fees required to desperately defend herself against federal extortion and medical fraud charges. She narrowly avoided heavy prison time by aggressively testifying against Julian, but she is currently serving thousands of hours of mandatory community service cleaning up trash on the exact same city streets she used to arrogantly look down upon. Dr. Vance lost his highly lucrative medical license permanently and is currently sharing a federal cell block with the very man who illegally bribed him. Nova Freight Logistics did not completely collapse into absolute bankruptcy. The wealthy venture capital investors successfully stabilized the massive company by officially installing Marcus as the brand new chief executive officer. He completely rebuilt the corporate structure from the ground up, stripping away Julian's toxic vanity projects and turning the massive logistics firm into a genuinely ethical and highly profitable enterprise. We occasionally meet for expensive lunches in the downtown financial district, laughing quietly about the massive corporate war we successfully fought and completely won together. My son will grow up completely surrounded by genuine love, massive generational wealth, and the absolute truth about his incredible origins. They thought they could steal my future to fund theirs. But when you try to bury a woman who knows how to code, you had better make sure you are not standing on the trapdoor she built. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below.